Hey guys, welcome back to the Red Bed. Today I've got over 3 hours of real life Reddit stories for you to chill with, whether you're falling asleep, relaxing, or just want some background noise. Most of these are about family drama, revenge, and just some bizarre situations that random people have experienced. And while you listen, I'll be sharing some hardcore gameplay I got today where I risked my life trying to save my friend from the warden, grind to get enchanted books to upgrade my armor, explore the Mesa Mountains with my friend, and much, much more. Also, thank you all for 100 subscribers. It really motivates me to keep improving my vids and post them every night. But anyways, kick back, relax, and enjoy. This first story is about a yearbook committee member who quietly edited out a cruel, anonymous tribute so a bullied classmate wouldn't be humiliated at graduation. This happened during my last year of high school, and honestly, I've never told anyone about it until now. I was on the yearbook committee, which mostly meant long evenings in the art room, cutting layouts, stapling proofs, and trying not to fall asleep under fluorescent lights. We had a tradition where seniors submitted short write-ups about each other, little blurbs that were supposed to be sweet, funny, or at least harmless. Most of them were exactly that. A lot of them were lighthearted jokes or inside references that classmates would understand. One afternoon, while I was going through the submissions, I came across an entry for a boy who'd never been part of the popular crowd. He'd been picked on pretty steadily throughout school. Small, cruel things at first, then a pattern that made his whole high school experience harder. He wasn't mean. If anything, he was awkward and quiet. He didn't fit the group dynamics. He liked different things, wore different clothes, and had this shy way of existing that made him an easy target for other kids trying to boost their social standing. On the surface, the yearbook blurb looked like a tribute. It used a friendly, joking tone, but underneath, it was full of tiny barbs. There were subtle digs about his crush that anybody who remembered a particular hallway joke would get. There were little comments about his outfits and his manner that read friendly unless you knew the backstory. Then they became sharp. It was the sort of cruelty that slid in under the radar because it masqueraded as humor. The whole thing felt like someone taking a final cheap shot at a person who'd already been knocked down. That realization made my stomach drop. The submission was anonymous, but the email address gave a clue. It matched one kid who always tried to make jokes to get attention. He was the kind who laughed the loudest when others did poorly or fell out of favor. I remember sitting there, looking at the lines of text and feeling an immediate, heated mix of embarrassment and anger. This was supposed to be a last piece of school memory that went out to everyone who'd worked so hard to graduate. To weaponize it felt wrong. I thought about what I was allowed to do. The rules were clear. You don't change submissions. Our job was to transcribe and lay out what came in, not edit content. But the cruelty in that paragraph didn't feel like a rule violation I could stand by. I made a choice in a quiet moment, with nobody watching. I didn't rewrite the whole thing. If I'd made it overly glowing, that might have looked suspicious. But I removed the mean parts. I smoothed out the tone, kept it neutral and kind, and made sure there were no hidden jabs or references that could reopen old wounds. After that, I put it back into the layout and moved on. When the yearbooks arrived, everyone flipped through them, laughed at the goofy captions, and pointed out who'd written what. No one questioned his entry. As far as I know, the boy never knew how close he came to being publicly humiliated one last time. I never told him, and I never told anyone on the committee. Part of me felt like I'd done a small, quiet right. Part of me felt guilty for breaking the rules. Another part, oddly, felt relieved that no one would have to relive that humiliation at graduation. Years later, I still think about that moment sometimes. I'm expecting my first kid now, which has made me look back at the ways children treat each other and the kind of person I want them to be. I wish I'd had the courage to say something out loud then, to confront whoever wrote it, or to announce that cruelty has consequences. But I also know I did what I could in the situation I was in. I used a small, anonymous act to protect someone who didn't deserve to be hurt again. I'm not proud of breaking the guideline that said not to change content, but I am at peace with how I did it. That's where this story ends. I kind of like how understated that was. It wasn't about making a big stand or being noticed, just stepping in quietly and keeping things from getting worse. It makes me think about how a lot of important moments in life aren't flashy at all. They're the ones nobody else even realizes happened. There's something very real about that. This next story is about a woman whose birthday night out with her partner spiraled into a public fight, after he repeatedly insulted her and tried to control her behavior. I'm 23, and last weekend I went out with my partner, John, who's 24. It was supposed to be an early birthday celebration for him with his friends, since his actual birthday was the following weekend. At first I thought it would just be a fun night. We met at his place, rode with some of his friends, and headed to a pre-drink at an apartment before going out to a bar. On the way there, something already felt off. The Uber dropped us a little ways from the right spot, and as we walked, I was chatting casually, just making conversation. Out of nowhere, John pulled me aside and told me I was acting crazy, that I was talking too much, and that I needed to be quiet. It threw me completely off balance. I didn't know how to respond, so I just let it go for the moment. When we got to the apartment, I greeted everyone and sat at the table while waiting for my younger sister to arrive. John wanted me to sit with him and his friends, but I stayed put. One of his friends, Alex, came over and struck up a simple conversation about uni, and we just chatted normally until my sister walked in. Once she arrived, she and I spoke in our native language, which John doesn't understand. When he asked what we were saying, I told him it was nothing important. That seemed to irritate him even more. After a while, some people joked about me being quiet, so I asked his friends directly if I'd been acting crazy or annoying earlier, just to check myself. They all said no, which John overheard. Not long after, he came into the room where I was sitting with my sister and accused me again of being too high energy. He told me I should come down to his level. I told him flat out that I shouldn't have to mirror him all the time. That frustrated him even further. From that point on, things kept escalating. Throughout the night, he came up to me in front of others and said things like, "If you don't want to be here, you can F off." He said it more than once. At the bar, after he repeated it again and started swearing at me, he demanded a kiss, and I refused. He got in my face and kept pushing it, and I finally snapped. I knocked his drink out of his hand, and when one of his friends offered me another, I poured it right over his head. That's when he shoved me back, hard enough to punch me in the shoulder. My sister and I left right after that. Later, John told me I embarrassed him in front of his friends, that I ruined his birthday night, and that I made a huge scene. But from my side, I felt like I was just defending myself. I hadn't done anything to deserve being called crazy, or being told to leave over and over. For context, John had been drinking heavily earlier in the day, and also took some drugs at the pre-drink. I'd been drinking too, but not as much. This was the first time we'd ever argued on this level. Before, it was small disagreements, like over movies. The only other real fight we'd had was when he said I wasn't doing enough for him, which actually came out of me bringing up that he was selfish in bed. I tried to talk about it carefully, and we'd eventually smoothed it over, or at least I thought we had. After we left the bar, I ended up crying at another party, surrounded by friends who supported me. Early the next morning, I went to John's house to pick up the rest of my things. His dad let me in, but when John and I started arguing again, his dad suggested I come back later. I refused. I just wanted to get my stuff and be done. Outside, John told me I'd humiliated him, and I shot back that he'd humiliated me first. He argued that I should have acted like nothing happened in the moment and talked about it later. Then he said something that froze me, that I acted like I couldn't be controlled and that I should be more submissive. I told him before I'd never accept being forced into that kind of role, and hearing him double down on it just confirmed what I'd already started realizing. In the texts we exchanged afterward, things got nastier. He told me to go F someone else, called me dishonorable, and threw more insults my way. I kept pushing back, but I knew deep down I was done. By the end of it all, I didn't regret pouring that drink on his head nearly as much as I regretted not walking away the very first time he spoke to me like that. That's the end of this story. What really stands out here is how fast the mask slipped. At first it was little digs, calling you crazy, but then it turned into swearing, public humiliation, and even that line about wanting someone submissive. It's jarring when someone shows you a side of themselves you hadn't seen before, and once you do, you can't unsee it. Nights like that don't just ruin a birthday, they change how you think about the whole relationship. This next story is about a woman whose long and stable marriage was suddenly shaken when a stranger accused her husband of having an affair, all based on a claim that made no sense. I've been with my husband, who I'll call Jay, for over 26 years now, and married to him for just about 25 and a half. He's truly one of the most wonderful people I know. To understand why this situation rattled me so much, I should give you some background. I had a very rough and dysfunctional childhood. It was abusive, filled with things I spent years in therapy working through. I came out of it with severe anxiety, post traumatic stress, obsessive compulsive tendencies, and later an ADHD diagnosis. Through all of that, Jay was always by my side. He supported me with patience, kindness, and even humor, especially when it came to living with ADHD. In fact, he was the one who first suggested I should get tested. Sure enough, I was diagnosed about 10 years ago. We first met when my daughter, T, was 8 years old. I had been raising her on my own, so we were very close. When Jay and I decided to marry, one of the first things he suggested was family counseling, because he wanted to make sure the three of us blended into a real family. That alone told me the kind of man he was. It wasn't always easy, but we worked at it, and the bond that grew between Jay and my daughter has been amazing. Today, they love each other deeply. So when I say I trust him implicitly, I mean it. We've been through so many challenges over the years, the kind that could have easily broken us. There were times I thought Jay might finally give up and walk away, but he never did. He stayed. He's never left my side. That's the level of trust I have in him. Now imagine the shock when an older man stopped us one day and accused my husband of having an affair with his wife. At first, we thought he was joking. The man and his wife were both well into their 80s, and the whole thing seemed so far-fetched that Jay and I actually laughed. But then we realized he was dead serious. He told us that the supposed affair had taken place during the lockdown period when I was at work. I quickly corrected him. There was no way. I'm a teacher, and during that time, I taught remotely from home for over a year. There wasn't a single day when Jay and I weren't in the same house. So we asked this man where he even got such an idea. He told us that his wife, who was in the late stages of Alzheimer's, had confessed it to him. My heart sank hearing that, because I know how confusing and heartbreaking Alzheimer's can be. We asked if he had any idea when this supposed affair was supposed to have happened, because we actually have motion-activated cameras around our house. I'm cautious by nature, so yes, we have footage going back a long way. We told him that if he could give us a time frame, we'd be able to pull the footage and prove that his wife had never even been near our home. But he admitted he didn't know, and he couldn't ask her because of her condition. Still, he wouldn't back down. He told me that my reaction, standing up for Jay, was exactly what all people say when confronted with the truth. That just made me furious. I laid it out as plainly as I could. There was no way this happened. Jay would never do that to me. He treats me with respect. We spend our lives together, and there have never been red flags. None. But even as I stood there, explaining and defending my husband, the man just wouldn't let go of his suspicion. It was surreal, standing there being accused of something so absurd, based only on the words of a woman whose memory and grasp on reality were already slipping away. And yet, the anger I felt wasn't just about the accusation. It was also about having this kind of chaos thrown into our lives after all we'd been through. Now I'm left asking myself, what do I even do next? Part of me feels like I should get a restraining order, just to make sure he stays away from us. At the same time, I find myself wondering if that's too much. After all, this is an 80-year-old man, and he's probably scared and overwhelmed by his wife's condition. But still, the thought that he could stir up accusations against Jay makes me want to protect my family no matter what. Of all the crazy things I've lived through, this honestly tops the list. That's where the story ends. The whole situation just sounds exhausting. When trust in a marriage is solid, it's wild how outside noise can still shake things up for a moment. I can see how something like that would feel both infuriating and surreal. It's one of those moments where life just throws something completely unexpected at you, and you're left sitting with the strangeness of it all. This next story is about a homeowner who was constantly harassed by a neighbor's complaints, only to turn the tables by pointing out the neighbor's own violations. Back in 2022, I moved into a 5-acre property. Even though it's a decent chunk of land, it still falls within city limits, which means we have to follow all the usual city bylaws. At first, I thought it would be a peaceful place to live, but that peace didn't last long. Almost right away, my neighbor started calling the city on me. Between April of 2022 and now, he's reported me more than 20 times. And when I say reported, I mean he's called city bylaw enforcement, the city police, and even the land use bylaw office. He's filed complaints about things like my dogs barking, me building a pallet fence that wasn't even permanent, the 8x14 deck I built in my yard, long grass in the summer, and even about me bringing my work truck home. None of it was anything serious. It was just him picking at whatever he could. After months of this nonsense, by November last year, the bylaw officers themselves finally told me I should file a harassment claim with the police. So I did. When the police came, my neighbor agreed to stop with the constant phone calls. They even gave him my number so he could reach me directly, instead of dragging the city into it every single time. For a little while, things were quiet, and I thought maybe the worst was over. But that didn't last. About 3 months ago, the calls started again. He reported me for parking my RV trailer, for long grass, and even for a noise complaint. The funny part about that one is that at the time he called it in, everyone who lives in my house was away on vacation. No people, no animals, nothing. The house was completely empty. Yet somehow, he complained about noise. At that point, I was done. After 3 years of this back and forth, I'd had enough. I decided if he was going to keep dragging the city into my life, maybe it was time I took a closer look at his property. So I sat down and started going through the bylaws myself. First, I looked up the rules about vehicle storage. In my city, you're not allowed to keep vehicles on your property if they aren't registered or insured. You also need a special permit for certain cases. Well, this man has upwards of 40 vehicles illegally stored on his property. 40. That's not even an exaggeration. Then I noticed the shipping containers, 3 of them. In our city, you need a building permit to place shipping containers on your property, and they have to sit on a proper parking pad made of asphalt or something similar. He didn't have any of that. And for the final touch, I found out he actually rents those vehicles out to movie studios for local filming. That would be fine if he was licensed to run a business, but he doesn't even have a business license. So I reported all of it. The city told him he has to remove the vehicles and the shipping containers before the end of the month. On top of that, he has to move all of his RVs and utility trailers either onto the paved section of his driveway or completely off the property. After years of being harassed for the smallest things, it felt surreal to finally see the spotlight turned back on him. That's where the story ends. It's kind of wild how some people spend so much time looking for trouble in other people's yards while ignoring what's going on in their own. 3 years of constant reports would push anyone to the edge. I think it's interesting how, once you dig a little deeper, the situation flips so completely. Honestly, that's a lot of vehicles to be hiding on one property. This next story is about a teenager frustrated with parents who force every activity to include his siblings, leaving him with nothing that feels like his own. I'm 16 years old, and I have a younger sister who's 14, and a younger brother who's 12. Both of them are on the autism spectrum. My parents think the reason we're not closer is because I'm being ableist or that I don't want to spend time with them. But that's not it. The truth is, I just don't want everything in my life to revolve around doing things together as a family. My parents have always been big on this idea that family comes first. And by that, I don't mean the normal kind of family first attitude where you support each other. For them, it means if you've already made plans with friends, or if something important is happening outside of the house, you cancel it. No questions asked, because family time overrides everything. They've forced that on us our whole lives. There were times they RSVP'd yes for me to go to a birthday party, but when the day came, they wouldn't even bother telling the other parents that I wasn't coming. They'd just keep me home, saying I had to spend time with the family. I wasn't even allowed to let my friends know. They would take my phone away before I could send a quick message explaining. Other times they'd say I could invite a friend over, but then at the last minute, they'd send them away because my parents suddenly decided it needed to be a sibling day. That happened more than once. Some of those kids ended up stranded without rides home, and after that, their parents didn't want them hanging out with me anymore. To be honest, I lost friends because of it. When it comes to my siblings, my parents take their outlets very seriously. My sister has piano and violin lessons, and my brother is in drawing and painting classes. They spend a fortune on those. But for me, it was never the same. If they had to pay for something I wanted to do, it always ended up being turned into a shared thing with my siblings. They might not say that right away, but it always happened. For example, I tried boxing when I was younger. My brother was way too young for it, but they dropped him off with me anyway and insisted he join. I couldn't handle it, so I quit. Later, I tried swimming. My sister wasn't even in the same group as me, but my parents insisted she go during my time slot, so she'd be there every session. My dad would make a fuss about us doing it together, and after a while, it just wasn't enjoyable anymore. I quit that too. Eventually, I stopped asking for things that cost money because I knew it wouldn't really be mine. I tried to talk to my parents about it. I explained that I didn't want my siblings involved in everything I did, but they got mad. They said it went against everything we believe in as a family and that I should want to include them. They told me it was wrong to throw things away just because I didn't want to share with my siblings. A friend of mine told me about the community center in our area where they had free activities. They weren't as polished as the paid stuff, but I thought it might give me a chance to have something that was just for me. I tried photography for a while, but my parents enrolled my brother too. More recently, I tried cooking classes, and once again, they decided both of my siblings needed to join in. It felt like no matter what I tried, they always turned it into a group thing. I quit again, and that made my parents angry. They told me it looked bad for someone my age to start things and quit them, that colleges would close doors on me because of it, and that it made me look like I couldn't commit. I told them I didn't care. I told them I wanted something for me, not just another excuse to spend more time with my siblings. That didn't go over well. They said I was being unreasonable and that people would kill to have a family like mine. They even accused me of being a bully, saying my siblings would believe I hated them. I finally snapped. I said if my siblings are allowed to have their own things, piano, violin, painting, then I should be allowed to have something too. I told them I was done trying because nothing was ever going to be just mine. When they got mad at my attitude, I told them to kick me out because that sounded better than living like this. Now, I'm not allowed to do anything with friends or go anywhere alone. My parents say it's punishment and that I'll only be allowed to go out if I bring my siblings or go as a family. They've told me I'm being a brat and a hurtful one at that, and that I'm just making things worse for myself. That's where the story ends. That's a tough spot to be in. Wanting something of your own doesn't mean you care any less about your family. It's pretty natural to need space, especially as a teenager. I can see how the constant overlap would make things frustrating and exhausting. It's one of those situations where there aren't easy answers, but I can understand why it feels overwhelming. This next story is about someone betrayed by both a best friend and an ex, only to turn the tables in an unexpected way. It all started with a breakup that hit me hard. I was heartbroken, blindsided, and completely thrown off balance. The kind of breakup where you're left sitting in the quiet, wondering how you didn't see it coming. But what really cut deep wasn't just losing a relationship. It was finding out, only a couple of weeks later, that my best friend, let's call her Sarah, was already dating my ex. That betrayal felt heavier than the breakup itself. I'd been there for Sarah through everything. Late night calls, messy situations, the kind of friend who sticks around no matter what. And then suddenly, she was with the one person she knew would hurt me most. It felt like being backstabbed by the two people I trusted most. At first, I was furious. I thought about confronting them both. I played out a dozen scenarios in my head, from dramatic sit-downs to shouting matches. But after a while, I realized something. Stooping to their level wasn't worth it. If they were willing to do that to me, then maybe the best revenge wasn't confrontation. Maybe it was something quieter. So I kept my distance. A few months rolled by, and I let them think I was still sitting in my room, crying over what happened. They had no idea what I was really up to, because while they thought I was stuck in that heartbreak, I was busy putting my life back together in ways they couldn't even imagine. I landed a new job, one that gave me purpose and a paycheck I was proud of. I started hitting the gym regularly, not just for the workouts, but because it gave me structure and strength. And little by little, I started going on dates again. Nothing rushed, nothing messy, just meeting people who actually respected me and wanted me for me. The best part, I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't tell my ex. I didn't post it all over social media. I just lived my life and let them assume I was stuck in some spiral of heartbreak. I wanted them to believe I was still broken, because it made the reveal later that much sweeter. Then, out of nowhere, Sarah reached out. She sent me this long message, filled with tearful apologies, saying she missed me, saying she wanted to make things right. Reading it was almost surreal, because by that point, I had already moved on. I wasn't bitter anymore. I was done. So I kept my response simple, short, and calm. I told her, "Glad you two are happy. Honestly, I'm better off. Let's just not talk anymore. I'm fine." That was it. No drama, no begging her to see my side. Just closure. on my terms. A couple of weeks later, I ran into my ex at a bar. The timing was almost too perfect. He looked at me awkwardly, like he didn't know what to say, but still tried to start a conversation. I just smiled, leaned in a little, and said, I think things worked out for the best. You're with Sarah now. That's great. But I've found someone way better. And the thing is, I wasn't lying. I really had. The look on his face said it all. I could see the wheels turning in his head, wondering who it was, what they were like, and why he hadn't heard about it. I walked away without giving him another detail. And that was enough. Because the ultimate revenge wasn't yelling or getting messy. It wasn't about making a scene or trying to hurt them back. It was just living well, moving on, and letting them see me happy without them. And to me, nothing burns worse than being forgotten. That's the end of this story. That one feels satisfying in a really quiet way. Sometimes the best payback isn't loud at all. It's just showing up happy when people expect you to still be broken. I like how simple and steady that was. It leaves you with the sense that walking away really can say more than anything else. This next story is about a broke student who took a risky trip overseas, found kindness from a stranger in an airport, and then paid it forward in a way that changed 2 lives. A few years back, I was basically penniless, broke uni kid territory. No real family backing, no safety net, just me and one person who mattered. My girlfriend at the time, who lived on the other side of the world. I scraped together the cheapest ticket I could find and booked a week in Los Angeles to see her. I knew it was risky. One mistake, and I'd be stranded in a foreign country with no way home. The trip to just reach LAX took over 2.5 days of travel, and by the time I reached Heathrow, I was completely wrecked. I remember collapsing into a chair in the terminal. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. Life had been piling on. My dad had disowned me weeks earlier. Uni was crushing me, and I hadn't slept properly in ages. In the middle of that airport, I started crying. Just quietly at first, then more openly. I couldn't form sentences well. English isn't my first language, and the tiredness made everything harder. A man walking by stopped when he saw me. He didn't ask 100 questions. He just crouched, opened his bag, and draped a blanket over my shoulders. He sat down beside me and offered his shoulder so I could rest against it. He told me not to worry, that his connecting flight wasn't for another 12 hours. I tried to decline, tried to say I didn't want to be a bother, but he ignored the refusal and asked if I'd eaten. I hadn't. I had planned to go without food until I made it to my girlfriend's place. Instead, he ordered me something from the airport restaurant, chicken ramen, and told me to eat. That bowl warmed more than my stomach. After I ate, I curled up and slept on his shoulder. It was maybe the best sleep I'd had in weeks. When I woke up, he was there, calm, telling me, "It'll be all right. It gets better." He walked me to my connecting gate, waved goodbye, and disappeared into the flow of passengers. At that moment, I didn't have anything to give him back, except my gratitude and the quiet knowledge that someone had chosen to be kind to me when I most needed it. I did make it to LAX, and I got to see the person who was my world at the time. We had a blast. The trip was tiring, sure, but lighter somehow, like a weight had been taken off me because of that stranger's small act. On the flight back, I ended up next to a much older gentleman who looked like he hadn't slept either. He was refreshing the news on his phone again and again, eyes fixed on a story in a way that said he was waiting for news about something important. I asked him if he was all right, and he didn't hesitate. He was worried about family in a conflict zone. He was heading on to Egypt after landing because extended family had been evacuated, but he was on edge, refreshing updates. He started to tell me about losses and displacements, about relatives lost in the diaspora. Something in what he said clicked in my head. He mentioned places where relatives sometimes ended up: Syria, Lebanon, Greece, and more. My heart raced because my father, difficult as he was Greek, and I knew the language. I told the man that I could read Greek and that I was willing to help look for names online. He handed me a list of relatives, and 10 minutes later, we were scrolling through profiles, translating captions, and finding leads. He was stunned and delighted. He laughed, thanked me, and hugged me like I'd given him something he'd been waiting his whole life for. We talked the rest of the flight. He was calmer by the end. I sat in Heathrow again, waiting for my next connection, feeling somehow full, like the kindness I'd received got passed straight on. Looking back, the trip was the most irresponsible thing I'd done in that moment of my life, given how fragile my situation was. And yet I wouldn't change it. That blanket, that ramen, that shoulder, those small things kept me going. And because of them, I was there for someone else when it mattered. To the man in Heathrow who kept my head off his shoulder, if you ever hear this, thank you. You saved me in a way that only someone who's been there can understand. That's where the story ends. There's something pure about that chain of small kindnesses. One tired stranger gives you a blanket and a meal, and later you get to be the person who helps someone find family. It's not dramatic, no grand gestures, but it shows how tiny, normal things can change the course of a day, or even a life. Those are the moments that stick with you. This next story is about someone torn between keeping a friendship alive and avoiding a friend's husband, whose rude behavior keeps making every outing unbearable. Not long ago, my husband and I went out for lunch with a couple we've known for a while, my friend and her husband. On paper, it sounded like a nice way to spend a Saturday afternoon, but the truth is, every time we've had a meal with them, it's felt more like a punishment than a pleasure. Her husband has no manners. That might sound blunt, but it's the reality. Over the years, I've seen him be short with servers, make unnecessary comments, and act entitled in situations where a little patience would have gone a long way. Still, I brushed it off because I wanted to spend time with my friend, but this last outing finally pushed me past my limit. From the moment we sat down, he was already on edge. The restaurant was busy, so it took a few minutes for the staff to come around and take our order. Instead of waiting like everyone else, he immediately demanded to see the manager. He wasn't just impatient, he was loud and aggressive about it, the kind of person who makes everyone else at the table want to shrink into the floor. I tried to smooth things over, even offering to cover the bill if it would calm him down, but he wouldn't let it go. He ended up arguing with the staff about being charged for something he had specifically requested. My friend sat there quietly, almost embarrassed, but she didn't try to stop him. At one point, she even said, well, he already talked to the manager, as if that excused his behavior. Meanwhile, I was sinking lower and lower in my chair, wishing the ground would swallow me whole. After we left, I couldn't stop thinking about how draining it had all been. I even emailed the restaurant afterward to apologize for his behavior, because I was so embarrassed to have been associated with the scene he created. That's when it really hit me. I don't want to see him again. Ever. The tricky part is that I love my friend. She and I get along so well, and when it's just the two of us, I genuinely enjoy her company. But being around her husband, it ruins everything. And it's not just about the restaurant scene. She also has to ask his permission for everything, even outings that have nothing to do with him. More than once, she's left me hanging for weeks because she couldn't commit to plans without checking in with him first. As a working mom, my free time is limited. I don't want to waste it sitting through another miserable dinner with a man who seems determined to pick a fight every chance he gets. The thought of spending another evening watching him argue over nonsense makes me want to clean my house instead. And trust me, scrubbing toilets doesn't usually rank high on my list of fun activities. But now I'm stuck in this awkward spot. What do I do when she asks for another double date? Do I make excuses? Do I tell her the truth, that we don't want to see her husband again? I worry that if I'm honest, I'll lose her friendship completely. And the hardest part is knowing that I might be her only friend. That's what makes the decision so heavy. That story wraps up here. That's a tough one because you can feel the pull in two directions, wanting to keep a friendship alive, but also needing to protect your own time and energy. It's never easy when someone you like is tied to someone who drains every bit of joy from the room. I think most people have had a moment where they realize spending time with certain people feels more like an obligation than a choice, and that's always a tricky place to be. This next story is about a family birthday tradition that took an unexpected turn when a bold food choice ended up being nearly impossible to stomach. In my family, we have this tradition for birthdays. Once the youngest of us aged out of the cake and gift stage, we decided to replace it with something more memorable. Instead of presents, the birthday person gets to pick an activity for everyone to do together. My sister usually picks museums or zoos, since she's into that sort of thing. Me, I like to use it as an excuse to explore new cuisines. A few years ago, it was my turn. I chose a Vietnamese restaurant I'd been wanting to try. I had eaten Vietnamese food before, and I really enjoyed it. so I figured it was the perfect chance to branch out and sample some new dishes. The menu was full of things I didn't recognize, which was exciting in its own way. After scanning it for a while, I settled on something called bamboo shoot soup, which came with duck on the side. Now, I had never had bamboo shoots prepared that way before, but the name sounded interesting. The duck sealed the deal, so I placed my order. The server paused for a moment, gave me this very particular look, and asked, "Are you sure?" At the time, I didn't think much of it. None of us at the table did. I just nodded confidently and said yes. The server hesitated, probably weighing whether to warn me further, then finally just wrote it down and walked away. Looking back, that little hesitation should have been the biggest hint, but we were clueless. The food arrived, and at first it looked fine. The soup was steaming, the broth a little cloudy, and inside were what looked like miniature stalks of bamboo. Up until that point, my only exposure to bamboo in food was the small, rectangular strips you get in a lot of Asian restaurants. That's what I was expecting. This was different, chunkier, more natural looking. The smell rising from the bowl was earthy, but not unpleasant. Honestly, I thought it might be a hidden gem, one of those dishes you'd never think to try unless you're adventurous. I spooned up some broth, let it cool for a second, and took a sip. The taste hit me like a wall. The only way I can describe it is that it tasted the way a zoo smells, that weird mix of hay, musk, and dampness, but somehow concentrated into liquid form. It was bitter, strong, and incredibly earthy. My face must have given me away immediately, because everyone else at the table started laughing nervously. One by one, my family members tried it, and every single person made the same expression of disgust. We all instantly understood why the server had asked me twice if I was sure about my order. It wasn't just a matter of not liking it, it was overpowering. The duck on the side was decent enough, so I focused on eating that. Meanwhile, we all picked at each other's plates, trading bites of different dishes and trying to salvage the meal. But that soup sat there like an unmovable challenge. We decided to take it home, thinking maybe we could fix it. Over the next day or two, we tried adding spices, broth, even mixing it with other soups. Nothing worked. The bitterness was too strong. Eventually, with some regret, we had to admit defeat and toss it out. At least we learned our lesson that day. Don't ignore the subtle warnings from servers who know what they're talking about. And no matter how adventurous you're feeling, sometimes a dish just isn't meant for everyone's palate. Oh, and yes, we did still leave a good tip. It wasn't the server's fault we made the mistake. If anything, they had tried to save us from ourselves. We just didn't listen. That story ends there. That made me smile a little because I know how it feels to take a chance on food and instantly regret it. There's something oddly memorable about those kinds of experiences though, even if they don't turn out well. I like how the whole family got in on trying to make it work afterward. It's funny how food can turn into a story you'll never forget, even when it doesn't taste good. This next story is about a man still grieving the loss of his brother, who is now struggling after his fiancée got a large memorial tattoo that feels unsettling to him. 3 years ago, my older brother died in a motorcycle accident. He was 30, I was 29, and losing him shattered me in ways I'm still trying to process. He wasn't just my brother, he was my best friend. We grew up inseparable, and unlike the stereotypical older brother who teases or bullies, he was always on my side. That bond was everything to me, and when he died, it felt like part of me went with him. My fiancée, Bella, only met him a few times. She doesn't have siblings of her own, and she always said she admired the closeness he and I shared. Recently, though, she did something that completely blindsided me. She revealed a tattoo she had gotten in his memory. It wasn't small or subtle. It was a large, realistic grayscale tattoo of his face, with a Snoopy icon beside it, his nickname, and his birth and death dates written underneath. It takes up a big part of her upper arm. When I saw it, I didn't even know what to say. At first, I was stunned. She explained she did it to honor him, to show me support, because she knows I still struggle with grief. On the surface, it was a gesture meant to be loving, but the more I sat with it, the more it unsettled me. Seeing my brother's face permanently inked on her body, my fiancé's body, felt strange and invasive, almost like a line had been crossed. I tried to explain this as gently as I could. I told her I appreciated the thought behind it, but that it made me really uncomfortable. I said it felt off, especially since she and my brother barely knew each other. Her reaction wasn't what I hoped for. She got upset, told me I was being weird about a beautiful gesture, and said I was making her regret doing something she thought was special. Since then, she's been distant. To make things more complicated, my mom thinks I should just be grateful that someone cared enough about my brother to memorialize him in that way. But here's the thing. I never asked her to do this. It was her decision alone, and now I'm left feeling trapped by it. It hits me hardest in private moments. She wears long sleeves during the day, but at night she'll wear tanks. And when we're lying in bed, I see my brother's perfectly rendered black and gray eyes staring back at me from her arm. It's unsettling in ways I can't even fully put into words, and I hate to even say it out loud, but it makes me dread intimacy, because the idea of my brother's face being right there in that context feels horrifying. Part of me wonders if I'm being unreasonable or selfish for reacting this way. Should I just accept it because it was meant as love? Or is it fair for me to ask her to cover it or remove it entirely? I don't know where the line is between respecting her choices and acknowledging that this tattoo is genuinely hurting me. That story ends there. That's such a complicated situation. On one hand, it's easy to see how she thought she was doing something supportive, but on the other, grief is so personal that it can hit in unexpected ways. The detail of seeing the tattoo at night and feeling that discomfort really stood out. It makes the reaction feel a lot more real. Sometimes even loving gestures don't land right. This next story is about a neighborly dispute that escalated after one man kept mowing over plants that weren't actually on his property. When I first moved into my place, I learned pretty quickly that my adjoining neighbor had gotten used to mowing part of the lawn between my driveway and his house. The previous owner, who had been my landlord, never minded, so the neighbor thought it was just part of his routine. But once I took over, I did mind. I wanted to make it clear where my property line really was. One afternoon, I saw him outside and decided it was the right time to have the conversation. I walked over with the city planning map in hand and showed him exactly where the line ran. My lawn extended right up to within 3 feet of the side of his house. He looked at it, nodded a little, and said he had always thought it was his because he'd always cut that patch of grass. I thought we understood each other after that, so I went ahead and planted some perennials in that space. Nothing big, just a few lilac runners that I'd gotten from my sister's lawn, some black-eyed Susans, and a few echinacea. They weren't in bloom yet, but I could already picture how nice that strip of land would look once they took root and started spreading. It felt good claiming that little piece of my yard as my own. But then one day, I looked out and realized he'd mowed them down. Not just the grass, my plants, the lilacs, the flowers, everything. All clipped to the ground before they even had the chance to bloom. I went over and confronted him. He played dumb, acting like he didn't know about the boundary we'd already talked about. He shrugged, said he'd always mowed that area, and didn't give me much else. That's when I realized this wasn't an innocent mistake. He was ignoring what I told him, maybe even testing me to see if I'd just back down. And if you've ever owned property, you know how important it is not to let someone else establish a right of way, or act like part of your land belongs to them. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let it slide. Out came the shears. I walked over to the patch of purple allium flowers he had planted, right in front of his porch. His pride and joy, from the look of them. I cut the stems clean, right in the middle, so it would be obvious it wasn't an accident. I left the blooms lying there, neat little casualties at the base of his porch. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, waiting. I saw him step out with his own mug, stretch, and look around. Then he noticed his flowers. He stood there, staring at them, cut and scattered on the ground. He didn't say a word. Not to me. Not to anyone. And you know what? He never mowed my lawn again. Later, I even found an iron rebar marker from an old survey just under the grass. I dug it up and showed him, just to remove any doubt. A couple of years after that, I had a professional survey done because I needed to put up a fence on the other side of my property. Turns out, not only was I right about the boundary with him, but I actually owned more land than I thought on the opposite side. That fence is up now, which also put an end to those neighbors using my driveway as their personal shortcut. Some of them had even driven across my lawn to get to the street. Not anymore. That's where the story ends. There's something kind of fascinating about how unspoken battles play out between neighbors. Sometimes it's not yelling across the fence, it's subtle actions, like cutting flowers or finding old survey markers buried in the dirt. I think those little standoffs end up shaping how people treat each other more than big arguments do. It makes you realize property lines aren't just lines on paper, they're emotional boundaries too. This next story is about a man who stayed loyal to his wife for nearly 2 decades, only to face repeated betrayals and now struggle with the decision to finally end their marriage. I'm 36 years old and I've been with my wife for 17 years. We've built a life together and we have 3 kids. From the very beginning, I believed in being faithful. To me, monogamy wasn't just a rule, it was the foundation of trust. Over the years, I had plenty of opportunities where I could have stepped out, but I never did, because I was genuinely happy with her. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about her. This isn't the first time she's broken that trust. Years ago, she got involved with a married coworker. It was an on and off affair that dragged on for years. When I found out, I separated from her. Eventually, though, I forgave her. I told myself we were young, that people make mistakes, and that maybe we could rebuild. Then later, during a trip out of state to visit family, she had a fling with her ex. That betrayal cut deep, and I separated from her again. But once more, I forgave her, convincing myself it was for the sake of the kids. I grew up in a broken home myself, and I didn't want that for them. For a while, it actually seemed like things were different. The last 4 years were calm. No secrets, no signs of betrayal. I let myself believe that maybe we'd turned a corner, that maybe all the effort I put into forgiving and moving on had finally paid off. I tried my best to trust her again, but about 2 months ago, everything came crashing down. I got a message out of the blue from my best friend's wife. She sent me screenshots that left no room for doubt. My wife was having an affair with him. It wasn't just harmless flirting either. They were sneaking off to hotels, meeting up on lunch breaks, and even making plans for a weekend getaway together. When I confronted the two of them, neither even tried to deny it. Her excuse was that she felt neglected. She told me she envied the way my friend treated his wife, and that she got carried away. She begged for forgiveness, saying she would do anything to keep the marriage together. She even went so far as to offer me what she called a free pass, saying I could sleep with other women as long as I came home to her. But to me, that's not what marriage is. That's not love. The truth is, I don't love her the way I used to. At this point, it feels like I'm just tied to her out of history and children, not genuine love. She's crossed the line too many times, and each time, something inside me broke a little more. I can't trust her anymore, and her words don't mean anything to me now. Right now, we're still living under the same roof because of financial reasons and the kids. She keeps pushing this idea that we shouldn't let the kids grow up in a broken home. But to me, staying together in this toxic situation would be even worse for them. Kids pick up on tension, on unhappiness. They'd grow up thinking this is what marriage looks like. I've already made my decision. I'm not staying with her. The marriage is over. The problem now is figuring out how to move forward. I've never dealt with lawyers, custody battles, or property division before, and the whole process feels overwhelming. The one thing I do have is proof. Enough proof of her affairs that she can't just flip the story on me. Even so, I'm worried about how it will all play out in court, especially when it comes to my kids. Right now, my mental state is wrecked. I'm angry, I'm exhausted, and I'm grieving the life I thought I had. But even with all of that weighing me down, I know I have to get through this, for my kids and for myself. That's where the story ends. That story hits heavy. You can feel the years of trying, the second chances, and then the final breaking point. It's a reminder of how complicated loyalty becomes when it's not shared equally. What really stands out is the quiet exhaustion underneath the anger, like someone who's finally reached the end of what they can give. This next story is about a woman who tried to support her brother-in-law through burnout, only to be accused of having an affair and attacked by her sister-in-law instead. My husband and I live about 15 minutes away from his brother and his brother's wife. Recently, while my husband was away on a work trip for several weeks, his younger brother showed up at my front porch, completely broken down. He was shaking, crying, barely able to breathe. I realized he was having a full-blown panic attack, so I stayed with him, calmed him down, and eventually got him checked by doctors. Their verdict was simple. He was completely burned out. At first I called his wife to let her know. I thought she'd want to help him, or at least show concern. Instead, her reaction was cold. She asked how long it would take before he could get back to doing chores and tasks for her. I was floored. I told her bluntly that it would take as long as it needed to, and that was the end of it. She was furious. Over the next hours, my brother-in-law opened up to me. He unloaded years of stress he had been carrying. He was not only the breadwinner of their family, but also the main caregiver for their daughter. For 7 years, he hadn't had a single moment to himself. No rest, no downtime, nothing. It was heartbreaking to hear. The doctor confirmed what I already suspected. He needed real rest and therapy. When I told him he could stay with me if he wanted, he hesitated but then agreed. He begged me not to tell his wife where he was staying because he knew she wouldn't allow it. I spoke to my husband about it, and he was fully supportive. Grateful I was there for his brother. I did eventually visit my sister-in-law to explain his condition. I told her he was burned out, suffering panic attacks, and needed time away. Instead of compassion, she rolled her eyes and said he shouldn't complain. Then she complained she'd have nobody to watch their daughter while she attended social events. I was speechless. I told her exactly what I thought, and she threw me out of the house. Since then, my brother-in-law has been staying with me. I've been handling his work calls, taking care of the household things, and balancing it all with my own work. It's been a lot, but he's family, and I'm in a stable enough place to help. My husband continues to support me from afar. Yesterday, for the first time since this started, he asked if he could join me while I walked the dog. It was a small thing, but it felt huge, like he was finally ready to step outside again. Unfortunately, someone saw us together and ran straight to his wife. That's when she exploded. Now she's telling anyone who will listen that I'm having an affair with her husband. She's painting me as someone who's trying to steal him away. Most of the extended family believes her because my brother-in-law doesn't want to admit publicly that he's struggling with his mental health. I've been ignoring the gossip as best I can, keeping him out of the mess because his well-being matters most right now. My husband knows the truth and has my back completely. But then my sister-in-law crossed another line. She showed up at my house, refused to leave, and started trashing my front lawn, the mailbox, even the front door. At that point, I had no choice but to call the cops. They came, removed her, and took her away. Now the family won't stop calling me, berating me, hurling names and accusations. I keep telling myself it's fine. We can clear everything up once my brother-in-law is stronger and in therapy. Right now, all that matters is giving him the safe space he hasn't had for years. That's where the story ends. That one really hits heavy. Family drama is hard enough on its own, but when mental health gets dismissed like that, it just adds another layer of weight. I respect how the focus stayed on making sure he was okay, even while the rumors and chaos swirled around. It feels messy, but sometimes messy is just the reality when people don't want to face the truth. This next story is about a couple on a rare date night who get pulled into a confrontation after a teen repeatedly films the movie, and his parents defend him. My partner and I finally managed to get a late night movie on our first proper date night in months. We've got a 2-year-old, so time for going out is rare, and that night felt like a small, precious escape. The theater was dim and the trailers were rolling when, about halfway through the film, I noticed the teenager in the row in front of me lift his phone and start taking pictures of the screen. At first it was just annoying, an interruption of the light and the moment, but I let it slide through 3 separate snaps, thinking maybe he'd stop. When he didn't, I reached forward and gently nudged his seat and asked him quietly to stop. He spun around with this look of shocked entitlement, like someone had interrupted a private performance, and told me to go away and watch the film. He put his phone down for a moment, and I thought that would be it. 2 minutes later, though, he was doing it again. Only this time he held the phone higher, trying to angle it more directly into my line of sight. It started to feel deliberately provocative. I leaned over once more and said I would fetch a staff member if he didn't stop. He told me off more loudly, using aggressive language, and that's when his mother decided to intervene. Loudly. She told me to mind my own business and to stop telling her child what to do. I repeated that I could get staff if she preferred, and she dared me to. Half the cinema was staring by then, so I left my seat and got a staff member. While I was gone, she turned and fixed my partner with a stare that lasted longer than any sane person would allow. making rude gestures and generally being hostile. The staff member took them outside for about 10 minutes. The father joined them a few minutes later. When they finally came back inside, they leaned over to tell the kid not to use his phone again. The kid responded with a cruel, hateful slur, an ableist insult, and I just sat there, exasperated. I tried to refocus on the film while the kid spent the rest of the show fidgeting and playing with his hands as obnoxiously as he could. It was less disruptive than the phone flashing, but still impossible to ignore. When the credits rolled, they were standing to leave, staring at me as if the world had been wronged. I said bluntly, "You need to learn some respect." The kid reacted by making faces and grabbing his crotch and acting like a little antagonist. I laughed, more out of disbelief than anything, and told them to grow up. As we left, one of them muttered, "So mature." That was the line that finally broke something in me. Out in the hallway, I stopped and turned to the mother. I told her, "You are an absolute failure as a parent. You should be ashamed." Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She stepped into my space, screaming in my face that I had no right to tell her what to do, accusing me of attacking her children. I told her she was clearly incapable, and if she wasn't going to manage them, someone needed to. That set her off even more. She started challenging me physically, asking if I was going to hit her. I laughed it off and said I wouldn't stoop to that. Her husband then pulled her back while shouting at me, calling me a loser for attacking their kids. There were people in the hallway watching, and the whole scene felt surreal. Poster of a rom-com turned into a bad reality show. My partner and I walked away. I admit I threw a few choice words over my shoulder on the way out. Not my finest moment, but I was drained. Date night ended on a low note, but I left feeling oddly relieved. There was a tired kind of satisfaction in standing up for a basic expectation, that people don't flash phones in a dark theater and they don't teach kids that disrespect is acceptable. That story wraps up here. It's wild how a simple night out can spiral like that. The part that stands out to me isn't even the kid. It's the parents doubling down instead of stepping in. That kind of reaction says more than anything their kid did. It leaves you walking away less angry and more just baffled at how people choose to act. This next story is about someone stuck with an ex as a roommate for years, only to discover he was freeloading, stealing, and planning to skip town without consequences. For nearly 6 years now, I've had the same roommate. And yes, believe it or not, he's my ex. From the very beginning, he never once paid rent, not a dime. For all that time, I've basically been housing a grown man for free, like some kind of ongoing charity project that I'd never signed up for. Looking back, I can't believe I let it go on for as long as I did. Then, a few months ago, things somehow managed to sink lower. At that point, not only was he living in my house rent-free, but he also had his girlfriend staying over all the time, freeloading right alongside him. So there I was, footing all the bills, while the two of them lounged around like it was their own place. When I went on a trip to California to see family, I came back to discover something that made my stomach drop. My Xbox was gone. At first I thought maybe I had misplaced it or loaned it out and forgotten, but no, it was just missing. I asked them about it straight away. I wanted to give them the chance to explain, but instead of a straight answer, they gave me excuses. They both swore they had no idea what happened to it, and then started trying to pin it on other people. They threw out vague suggestions like, maybe someone else came by while you were gone, as if strangers just waltzed into my house and happened to take only my Xbox. It was classic gaslighting, trying to make me doubt what I already knew in my gut. Fast forward to now. My ex is making plans to move across the country in a couple of weeks. And of course, his plan is to just skate away, leave behind years of freeloading, manipulation, and now theft, with zero consequences. But here's where things take a turn, because I finally got him to admit it. After all the dodging and deflecting, I managed to get him to say out loud that he took my Xbox and sold it at a pawn shop for $50. And here's the kicker. I had my phone in my pocket, secretly recording the whole thing. He doesn't know that, but now I've got a clear, undeniable admission that he stole from me. That recording gives me the upper hand. With it, I can file a police report. It wouldn't just be my word against his, it would be proof straight from his own mouth. And here's where it gets even juicier. He's already got a criminal record. A long one. We're talking aggravated assault, theft, the kind of stuff that doesn't just disappear. So even though this theft might seem petty on its own, Adding it to his record could actually land him in serious trouble. Jail time. Maybe even prison. So now I'm stuck with the question, do I just let it go, let him leave, and finally wash my hands clean of him? Or do I take the evidence I have and make sure karma catches up to him before he slips away? On one hand, I'd love to move on and not waste another ounce of energy on him. On the other hand, there's something tempting about finally seeing accountability after years of letting him get away with everything. That story ends there. That's a rough spot to be in. 6 years of someone draining you like that builds up a lot of frustration, and finding out they stole from you just takes it over the edge. I get why the idea of finally holding him accountable feels so heavy. It's not just about the Xbox, it's about all the years leading up to it. Sometimes the hardest part isn't deciding what's right or wrong, it's deciding what you have the energy to carry forward. This next story is about a son who was kicked out by his father at 19, only to be asked years later for financial support when his father fell on hard times. Back when I was 19, I was living with my dad. My mom had passed away when I was 12, so it was just me, my dad, and my younger sister. Growing up, my dad was always on the stricter side, but after mom died, that strictness hardened into something much heavier. He became controlling, short-tempered, and honestly mean. At the time, I was saving up money because I wanted to go to college out of state. That was something he was completely against. Every conversation about it turned into a fight. He said I was abandoning the family, that I was ungrateful, and that I was choosing to leave him behind. From my side, I just wanted a chance to build my own life. Then one night, after I'd worked a long double shift, I came home exhausted. Instead of the usual silence or argument, I found my belongings stuffed into trash bags, sitting by the door. He told me, flat out, that I was not his problem anymore. Just like that. No real discussion, no chance to explain. He kicked me out of the house without looking back. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch for months, working every shift I could find. I scraped together enough to eventually rent a small, barely livable apartment. It wasn't easy. Those first few years felt like climbing a mountain with no end in sight. But slowly, things got better. I graduated from college, got a steady job, and built some stability for myself. During all that time, contact with my dad was minimal. Holidays, maybe the occasional short call, but nothing that resembled a normal father-son relationship. I didn't hold out hope for one either. Then, just a couple weeks ago, my phone rang. It was him. I hadn't expected it, but he sounded different. Tired, desperate. He told me he'd been laid off and that bills were piling up. He asked me to help either by moving back in and contributing or by sending him money each month. He even guilt-tripped me, saying, "Your mother would be ashamed if she knew you won't help your own family." Hearing that stopped me in my tracks. He was the one who had told me, all those years ago, that I wasn't his responsibility. Now suddenly, I was supposed to shoulder his? I told him no. I explained I'd already worked too hard to pull myself out of that situation, and I wasn't willing to go back. After that, my sister got involved. She called me up, upset, saying I was selfish and punishing him for the past. I told her I'd forgiven him, but forgiving doesn't mean forgetting everything that happened or signing myself up to relive it. She didn't agree and said I was wrong for turning my back. Now I'm stuck wrestling with guilt. Part of me hears her voice and wonders if I really am being too harsh. He's my dad, and he's struggling. But another part of me can't forget the night he kicked me out, the months of being homeless, and the years of building myself up without his help. He made his choice, and it feels like I already paid the price for it. That's the end of this story. This one feels heavy. It's not just about money. It's about everything that happened before, all the history tied to it. You can hear how the past still sits in the middle of the present, shaping every part of the decision. Sometimes the hardest part isn't knowing what's fair, but figuring out how much of yourself you're willing to give back after being pushed away. This next story is about a hotel worker dealing with a guest who demanded to be treated like royalty, complete with endless requests, rude interruptions, and even some unsettling threats. I barely clocked in when I realized my night was about to be one of those shifts. The guy who had just checked in made it obvious right away. You know how some guests carry themselves like they're doing you a favor by being there? That was him, times 10. I greeted him like I always do. Friendly, polite, ready to get through check-in smoothly. "Welcome, can I get the name on the reservation?" I asked. He gave me his last name. When I repeated it back, he cut me off and said, "That's doctor to you, Dr. Schmuck." Right then, I knew it was going to be a long night. He immediately asked for 4 bottles of water, even though we normally hand out one. I went along with it, figured it was easier than arguing. As I explained breakfast hours and amenities, he stopped me again. This time it was to complain about my tone. First, I was talking too fast and too loud, so I repeated everything slowly and more quietly. Then suddenly, I was too slow. It was like nothing I did could land right with him. While this was going on, his wife jumped in with her own requests. Towels, then more towels, then tissues, then extra items one at a time, as if it was on purpose to keep me running back and forth. I tried to smile through it, but it was obvious they weren't going to be satisfied, no matter how much I gave. Later, while I was on the phone with another guest, the doctor himself came back down. He spoke loudly over me until I handed him the tissue his wife had forgotten. I didn't even answer him because I was still on the call, but that set him off even more. The way he carried himself, you'd think the entire hotel existed just for him. Not long after that, I noticed a car parked right under the awning at the front entrance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Guests sometimes idle there when unloading bags, but the car sat empty for almost an hour. Eventually, I checked the plates, and of course, it was his. When I called the room to let him know, he got huffy right away. He acted offended that I interrupted his meal, then demanded to know why my car was parked off to the side near the gardens. I explained that management allowed me to park there for my safety, especially on nights when I worked alone. That way I didn't have to walk across a dark lot at 3 in the morning. I wasn't blocking anything, but he insisted if I could park close, then he should be able to park directly in front of the entrance. I told him no. That spot wasn't for parking, period. It was for unloading guests and he was blocking the doors. He didn't care. He ranted about there being no signage, claimed I was being rude, took my name, and even wrote down my plate number. Then, just to make it more unsettling, he made a comment about me ending up on a gurney in his hospital someday. That part stuck with me. I thought about kicking him out right then and there. But after a long back and forth, he finally stormed off to his room. I stayed tucked away in the back office after that, just waiting for the day shift to arrive. Working overnight already has its challenges, but it always seems like I get stuck with the guests who treat staff like we're beneath them. That's where this story ends. That's rough. It's one thing to deal with demanding guests, but it's another when someone goes out of their way to be disrespectful and threatening. The way he latched onto titles and power says a lot about the kind of person he is. Honestly, it feels less like hospitality work and more like babysitting a grown man who never learned manners. Nights like that can really drain you. This next story is about a shy high school student who formed an unlikely bond with a lunch lady, only to be surprised by years of kindness and generosity. Back when I was a sophomore in high school, I was one of those quiet kids who mostly kept to themselves. I spent a lot of my time sketching in the corners of classrooms or doodling during lunch. One afternoon in the cafeteria, my pencil slipped from the table, rolled across the floor, and ended up right in the hallway. I remember sitting frozen, debating if I should get up to grab it, when one of the lunch ladies, an older woman with short silver hair, walked by and picked it up for me. She set the pencil on the table with a small smile, and I blurted out a compliment about her hair. It was this striking silver color, and I'd always been obsessed with the look. That sparked a small conversation. She asked about my sketches, I told her a little about my art, and before long we were chatting easily, even though she had to get back to work. It felt natural, like we'd known each other longer than a few minutes. The very next day, when I went to grab lunch, the cashier told me $20 had been added to my account. I had no idea who put it there, but it completely made my day. Growing up, money was always tight. I'd been taken from my mom when I was 8 and placed with my aunt and uncle, and things at home weren't always great. So to have something as simple as lunch covered, it meant a lot. As the week went on, I noticed something strange. Another 20 showed up on my account, then another. Every day, it seemed like someone was quietly making sure I didn't have to worry about food. Nobody would tell me where it came from, but I had a good guess. And every day, I kept talking to the silver-haired lunch lady, who I'll just call Jay. That became our routine. I'd usually end up last in line, partly because I didn't want to be in anyone's way, and partly because it gave me a chance to talk with her. Sometimes it was small stuff, art, anime, things we both liked. Other times it was just easy conversation that made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Then, around Halloween, I got called to the office. My heart sank, thinking I was in trouble. But when I walked in, the secretary just pointed to a small Halloween-themed gift bag. Inside were notebooks, art supplies, candy, 2 six-packs of root beer, and even a cozy blanket covered in cats and dogs dressed up in costumes. It was from Jay. I sat in study hall later, pulling out each item, and I actually cried right there at the desk. No one had ever done something like that for me. Over the next 3 years, it didn't stop. Gift bags, little surprises, more additions to my lunch account. Once she found out I loved anime, gaming, cosplay, and art, the gifts started reflecting that too. Shirts, gift cards, cosplay items, and eventually, one of the biggest surprises of all, a brand new gaming laptop. It was an Acer Nitro with a Razer mouse, mouse pad, and even a $100 Steam card. That alone would have been more than I could ever imagine, but she also took me out to the Cheesecake Factory, to Hot Topic, where she spent over $100, and even for boba and crepes. Looking back, I don't think I ever really understood why she did it all. I wasn't anyone special, just a quiet kid who liked to draw. But the truth is, those conversations and those small acts of kindness kept me going during some of the hardest years of my life. They reminded me that someone cared, even when things at home were rough. I eventually dropped out because of being homeless, and I lost touch with her. To this day, I only remember her as Jude, because that's what the other lunch ladies sometimes called her. I don't have her number anymore, but I still hope I can find her someday. She deserves to know how much she helped me, and that her kindness was something I'll never forget. That's the end of this story. That's such a powerful reminder of how small connections can change everything. What starts as just a quick chat over lunch turns into a memory that sticks with you for life. It makes you think about the people who step in at the right time, even if they don't realize how much it matters. I really hope they reconnect one day, because that kind of kindness deserves to be remembered. This next story is about a couple who let their roommate's girlfriend host a small party, only to be told they had to leave their own home for the night. My boyfriend and I bought our first house about 6 months ago. It's been a big adjustment, but overall things have gone well. We decided to rent out the spare bedroom to his best friend James to help with expenses, and it's worked out fine, at least until recently. We also have a 5-month-old puppy, and anyone who's had one knows that's basically a full-time job in itself. James has been dating his girlfriend Amy for about a year. She's around often, which we didn't mind at first. She's polite, but she's also incredibly socially awkward. Whenever my boyfriend or I try to get to know her, she barely engages. Sometimes she won't even say hi when we walk into our own home, which feels uncomfortable after a while. We've tried to chalk it up to her being shy. Amy has her own circle of friends, and we hung out with them once before. The problem was they were all high during that hangout, while we weren't, so it was next to impossible to have a real conversation with them. After that night, Amy never invited us to join again, which was fine. It wasn't exactly enjoyable trying to chat with people who weren't even responsive. A few days ago, James mentioned that Amy wanted to have some friends over at our place. He asked politely, and my boyfriend and I said, sure, just as long as things didn't get too loud and they cleaned up afterward. That seemed reasonable, so we didn't think twice about it. The night of the party, I got home from work right as people were arriving. I greeted them briefly, then went upstairs to freshen up. That's when Amy came into my room and asked, point blank, if my boyfriend and I could actually leave the house for a few hours so they could have privacy. I just stared at her, trying to process what she was asking. I reminded her that James had asked if it was okay to have a party, but nobody ever said anything about us having to leave our own home. She insisted James should have made that clear. I told her flat out that I couldn't leave because of the puppy. Her response? Oh, you can just leave him with us. We really like the dog. That suggestion alone made me feel uneasy. Why would I leave my 5-month-old puppy with people I barely know? I told her no again, firmly this time. I explained that she and James were welcome to have their party, but she couldn't expect us to vacate our house. She looked frustrated, and my boyfriend arrived home not long after. Once I told him what was going on, he was just as confused as I was. We ended up staying mostly in our room with the dog, while they did their thing in the rest of the house. The party itself wasn't an issue. No noise complaints, no mess. But the next morning, James texted us saying Amy felt humiliated because we didn't leave when she asked. According to him, she thought we'd ruined her night in front of her friends. He also said that Amy had felt uncomfortable with us ever since the first time we met her group because she thought we didn't make enough of an effort to connect with them. Never mind the fact that they were all too high to hold a conversation that night. James wanted us to cut Amy some slack and even apologize because she'd been having a rough time and needed the party to unwind. My boyfriend and I both said absolutely not. It's one thing to host a get-together in our home with permission. It's another to try and kick the homeowners out. I told James that if anyone owed an apology, it was Amy, and that she should say it directly to us rather than hiding behind him. At this point, there's no getting around the fact that Amy will continue to be around since she lives with her parents and spends so much time here. I can't control James's relationship, but I can decide how I interact with her. For now, though, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to handle things moving forward. That's where the story ends. It's wild how entitled some people can get once they get a little too comfortable in someone else's space. I can't even imagine asking the homeowners to leave their own house so I could party. It just shows how differently people can view boundaries. I think the couple handled it calmly, but you can tell this probably isn't the last time Amy's going to cause tension. This next story is about an artist who suddenly got dragged into old relationship drama when a client's past commission came back to haunt them 6 years later. About 6 years ago, I got a pretty normal commission request. A client, who I'll call Blue, asked me to draw her and her boyfriend's MMO characters together in a couples piece. Nothing unusual. It was the kind of thing I'd done plenty of times before. She wanted something sweet and romantic, and I delivered. She loved it. I posted it online, as I usually did, and then moved on to the next project. Over time, that piece sank deeper and deeper into my gallery, buried under years of new commissions, projects, and personal work. Fast forward all the way to 2024. Out of nowhere, I get a comment on that old piece. It was from a blank account with no posts, no history, nothing. The comment accused Blue of being a cheater and a homewrecker. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out if there was anything behind it, but the account looked like a throwaway. I assumed it was just someone trolling, so I deleted the comment, blocked the account, and didn't think much more about it. Then today, things got a little stranger. I received a direct message from another blank account. The weird part was, this one had literally been created just 15 minutes before the message landed in my inbox. That alone set off alarms in my head. The message claimed to be from Green, the boyfriend from the original commission. According to him, he had actually been married during his relationship with Blue. He said he'd confessed the affair to his wife and that they were working on repairing their marriage. But then came the part that made my jaw drop. He asked me to take down that 6-year-old art piece because it was bothering his wife. Here's where things don't add up. Earlier this year, Blue had actually commissioned me again. Same characters, same couple theme, just another sweet piece of MO fan art. I posted that one too, in the exact same place as the first. Yet in Green's message, he only mentioned the original piece. There was no mention of the second one at all, which left me wondering, how did they manage to find the buried artwork from 6 years ago, but completely missed the brand new one sitting at the top of my gallery? To be clear, I don't know Blue or Green outside of the internet. They're just random people who happen to commission me. I have no personal ties to them, no stake in whatever drama unfolded between them. For 6 years, I've been living my own life, doing my own work, and suddenly I'm dropped into this mess like an unwilling extra in their story. And honestly, after thinking about it, I decided I wasn't going to delete anything. I didn't cheat, I didn't lie. I simply provided the artwork I was paid to make, and I have no reason to erase it just because someone else made choices that came back to bite them. So if Green or his wife happen to stumble across my page again and see this, I'm sorry, but that old commission is staying right where it is. That's the end of this story. It's kind of wild how something as simple as an art commission can circle back years later in a way you'd never expect. I get why the guy's wife doesn't like seeing it, but trying to rope in the artist feels like misplaced frustration. Honestly, the whole thing just shows how messy situations can spill into places you'd never imagine. It's a reminder that once something is online, you never know who might stumble across it again down the road. This next story is about 2 roommates who had to deal with a shady landlord that constantly failed to pay the bills, leaving them stuck without power, heat, or internet, and eventually even facing a police search in their own apartment. Finding an affordable place to live where I'm at is almost impossible. So when my roommate and I finally landed an apartment through an acquaintance, We felt like we'd won the lottery. Even though the rent was higher than what we could really afford, the deal included utilities and internet. We told ourselves that made it worth it, and we brushed off the red flags that were staring us in the face. At the time, we just wanted some stability, and we convinced ourselves this was it. It didn't take long for the problems to start. The first big one was when our electricity got cut off. Not because we hadn't paid, but because the landlord hadn't. For 5 whole days, we were sitting in the dark with no power, no hot meals, and no way to save the food we had. Everything in the fridge spoiled. Legally, that meant we weren't required to pay rent for those days, and we even pointed it out. But the landlord flat out refused to reimburse us. We thought about taking him to court, but the time, stress, and cost just didn't seem worth it compared to the amount we'd get back. So, we let it go. Then it happened again. This time it was the heating, and it was November. Sitting in a cold apartment during the start of winter isn't something I'll forget anytime soon. After that, it became the internet. At first, it would cut out every other month, and after dealing with that hassle long enough, we just started paying the internet provider directly ourselves, just to make sure we had a stable connection. Through all of this, one thing never changed. We always paid rent on time. We never once failed to hold up our side of the agreement. The problem was him. Our landlord was simply pocketing the money instead of paying the bills. The final straw came out of nowhere. One morning, the police showed up at our door with a search warrant in his name. They walked straight in and started searching every room of the apartment. I'll never forget the moment they barged into the bathroom while I was in the shower. That was it for us. In reality, we'd already made the decision to leave a while before, but finding a new place in this housing market was brutal. Still, after the police incident, there was no turning back. We gave him proper notice. We sent him a text with our planned move-out date, requested a walkthrough, and asked about the keys and deposit. We even mailed a formal letter to his legally registered address, which, funny enough, was our own apartment. In that letter, we included proof of the utility shutoffs and even the police search as grounds for breaking the lease. And then, nothing. No reply to our text, no reply to the letter, no call. He completely ghosted us. At that point, we already knew we'd never see our deposit again. He was clearly not good with money and not good with responsibility. So we left. We didn't go full petty with shrimp in the vents or anything like that, but we also didn't bother to deep clean for his benefit. We just left it behind. But here's where the little bit of revenge comes in. After months of him ignoring us, leaving us without heat, power, and internet, and letting the police storm through our home, the roles flipped. Now he's the one desperately texting us every single day, asking if we're still going to pay rent, begging for us to answer, and even pleading with us to scan his important mail that still gets delivered to the apartment. Well, if ghosting was the game he wanted to play, then we were more than happy to join in. That's where this story finishes. I actually like how subtle that revenge was. No dramatic outburst, no big stunt, just silence. Sometimes ignoring someone hits harder than anything else could. It's kind of funny how the balance shifted so fast. He went from acting untouchable to being the one chasing after answers. This next story centers on a tense restaurant moment where a new dad's protective reaction to some teenager's comments turned an awkward encounter into an unexpectedly positive outcome. This happened years ago, when I was 28 and fresh out of the oil field, trying to get my life back on track by going to college. My wife and I had just welcomed our first child, a daughter, and everything felt simultaneously fragile and amazing. At that time, I was about 6'1" and around 220 pounds, still in pretty good shape. I played on the college rugby team, so I knew what it felt like to be big and to be careful with that size. One evening, when our daughter was only 2 months old, we decided to go out to a small, local pizza place. It was the kind of place with vinyl booths, the smell of baking dough and garlic in the air, and a low hum of conversations and clinking cutlery. We sat in a corner booth that felt cozy and private, and because we needed a hands-free moment, I put our daughter's carrier on the table between us. It didn't take up much space, maybe less than half the table, and she was bundled up and calm, the tiny rise and fall of her chest almost imperceptible under the soft blanket. My wife slipped off to the restroom for a minute, and I was left there watching the little thing in the carrier, just soaking in the normalcy of it. Across the dining area, a group of 3 high school girls were tucked into another booth. They were giggling and whispering, the kind of high-pitched laughter that bounces off the walls in a place like that. At first it seemed like the harmless background of a restaurant night. Then one of the girls stood up and wandered over to our table. She leaned over the carrier and asked if she could see the baby. I said sure, no big deal. She smiled, told me how beautiful our daughter was, and then said something odd about not setting the baby on the floor because a baby had been stepped on there earlier. It was a strange thing to mention out of the blue, but I just thanked her and went back to watching my daughter. A few minutes later, the giggling got louder, and all three girls came over together. They crowded around the table, and the girl who'd come first said, "I just want to show my friends what a beautiful baby you have, but you need to be careful so she doesn't get stepped on." There was a tone to it that didn't sit right with me, almost like a joke, but with a sharp edge. It felt like they were flirting with the idea of being intentionally provocative, seeing how I'd react. In that second, a protective instinct took over. I remember the air in the booth felt thicker. My voice stayed calm. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also wanted to make the boundary clear. I told them plainly that I wouldn't tolerate anyone hurting my baby. I said in words that left no doubt that if anyone stepped on her, I would stop them, and that there would be consequences for trying. I didn't roar or throw a fit. I spoke steady, and I made sure they understood I meant it. The effect was immediate. Their smiles faded. The giggling stopped. They shuffled back to their table, suddenly very small and very aware that their words had crossed a line. I watched them go and felt the adrenaline simmer down. A short time later, the three girls left the restaurant altogether. Not long after that, the manager came over to our table. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and told me he wanted to thank me. He said those girls came in often, ordering only iced tea with free refills, and that they tended to harass other customers. He'd been watching the interaction and appreciated that I'd handled it the way I did. He said something about how some people don't take those things seriously, and that it was good to see a parent stand up for his child. I told him we just had a normal conversation, and that I was glad it had worked out without anything worse happening. Looking back on it now, I can see how the situation could have gone differently if I'd overreacted or if they'd pushed further. But in that moment, everything was about keeping my daughter safe and making sure she stayed out of harm's way. The whole thing ended quietly, with the manager's thanks and the normal clatter of the pizza place returning around us. That's where this story ends. There's something striking about those small, intense moments of parenthood where you find out what you'll stand up for. It wasn't about bravado. It was about a firm boundary that made the rest of the night calm again. Those tiny tests show you what matters, and sometimes they lead to unexpected appreciation from the people around you. This next story is about a neighborly feud that started when one man decided the shade from another person's tree was community property, and things escalated when he tried to pay tree rent instead of moving his car. So this is going to sound made up, but I promise it's completely real. I live in the Southwest United States where the summers get brutal. I'm talking 110 degrees Fahrenheit or about 43 degrees Celsius, day after day. The kind of heat where the air feels heavy, the pavement shimmers, and you start planning your whole day around how little time you can spend outside. Now, in my front yard, I happen to have this big old tree. It's one of those sprawling shade trees, the kind that covers a good stretch of sidewalk and even a slice of the street once the sun gets high. From late morning through the afternoon, it throws this wide, cool patch that makes walking past my place feel like stepping into a different world. Across the way, my neighbor Leo isn't so lucky. His yard is bare, no trees at all, and his driveway bakes in the sun from dawn to dusk. Last month, during a nasty heat wave, I noticed Leo had started parking his car under my tree. Not all the way on my lawn, but enough that the tires left marks in the grass, and sometimes he'd block my trash bins or the mailbox. At first I figured it was a one-off, but when it kept happening, I decided to ask him about it. I approached him casually, trying to keep things friendly, and said, "Hey, could you not park on my lawn? It's leaving tracks and kind of getting in the way." That's when he gave me this strange look and said something I didn't expect. He told me I don't own the shade. His words were, "If the tree naturally covers public space, it's like sunlight or rain. Everyone should be able to use it." He even half joked that if I really had an issue, he'd pay me rent for the shade. I laughed it off in the moment, not sure how serious he was. But the next day, I found a $5 bill taped to my front door with a handwritten note. This week's shade rent, thanks. And sure enough, his car was back under the tree again. That's when I told him more firmly, look, I don't want your car on my lawn at all. The money doesn't change anything. I thought that would settle it, but instead he got defensive. He said I was being uptight and that most people would share something nature provides, especially in dangerous heat. His wife even went on Nextdoor and posted about selfish neighbors refusing to share community cooling. She didn't name me outright, but it was pretty obvious who she meant. To be clear, I get that it's hot. I get that standing under the tree or walking through the shade is something anyone can do. But having a 2-ton vehicle parked on my grass, crushing the lawn, blocking access to my own bins and mail, that's not the same thing. At the end of the day, I feel like I should be able to keep my yard free of tire marks, no matter how shady it is. That's where this story ends. This one made me pause because it shows how people can twist something simple into a bigger issue than it needs to be. On one hand, shade is for everyone. It's not like you can fence in sunlight, but turning it into shade rent and parking a car on someone else's lawn is a whole different thing. It's such a strange mix of entitlement and creativity that I can't help but shake my head at it. Honestly, it just makes me think about how quickly small neighborly tensions can spiral. This next story is about someone who finally got the chance to play a claw machine as an adult, only to end up making 2 little kids' days in the process. When I was a kid, my parents were pretty strict about arcade games. We didn't go to amusement parks often, and even on those rare trips, I wasn't usually allowed to spend time or money on arcade machines. I didn't resent them for it, but there was always this one thing that stuck with me: the claw machines. To me, they looked magical. The flashing lights, the slow claw hovering over plush toys, and the idea of winning something cool. It always seemed like the ultimate thrill. But as a kid, I never got the chance to try them out. Fast forward to today. I'm 25 now, living on my own, but I had gone back to visit my parents for a couple of days. My mom and I ran out for a small grocery errand. Nothing fancy, just one of those quick trips. We walked into this tiny convenience store, and right there at the entrance was a brand new claw machine. I froze in place for a second. I swear, I felt like I was 10 years old again, wide-eyed, excited, like I'd stumbled across something I'd been waiting for all my life. I tried to play it cool though, so I finished the shopping quickly. But as soon as we were done, I practically darted back toward the claw machine. When I got there, I saw 2 little girls, maybe 4 or 5 years old, standing by the machine. They were pressing buttons and fiddling around, but it didn't look like they had any money in it. I crouched down a little and asked if they were playing. Both of them shook their heads and said no. So I put in my own money and grabbed the joystick. They stood right by my side, peeking up past my arm as I moved the claw around. I could feel their anticipation almost as much as my own, like we were all in this together. The claw hovered over a toy. Don't even ask me what it was, because I honestly can't remember. But I pressed the button, the claw dropped, and to my absolute shock, it actually picked something up. When it dropped into the chute, one of the girls darted her hand in, scooped it out, and then held it up to me with the biggest grin. I just shook my head gently and told her she could keep it. After all, I wasn't there for the prize. I was just there to finally experience the claw machine. The way both their faces lit up when I said that was something I'll never forget. They clutched the toy like it was treasure and ran out of the store laughing. My mom came back to join me, and we stepped outside not long after. That's when I saw the 2 little girls again, this time with their mom. The girls ran up to her, still showing off the toy, and their mom looked over at me and asked if I had given it to them. I nodded, and she gave me such a genuine thank you. It was such a small thing for me, but for them, it clearly meant so much more. To this day, that little moment still makes me smile. Out of all the memories I've held on to, it's one of my absolute favorites. That's the end of this story. This one just feels wholesome all the way through. It's funny how something small, like finally playing a claw machine, can turn into a memory that sticks with you for years. What I like most is that the joy ended up being shared. It wasn't just about winning, it was about passing that excitement on to someone else. Sometimes it's those little, unexpected moments that end up meaning the most. This next story is about a mom who felt torn between protecting her only free day of rest and the pressure from family to put her young daughter in sports. I'll be honest, my husband says I'm being selfish, and maybe I am. But from my perspective, it's not just selfishness, it's strategy. Right now, my life is packed to the brim. I'm a mom of 2 kids under the age of 4, 5 months pregnant, working full-time as a kindergarten teacher, and dealing with narcolepsy on top of it all. That means I live every single day, already tired before it even begins. Saturday is the one day of the week I don't have any set plans. It's the one space on the calendar where I can breathe, choose what I want to do, and not feel bound by commitments. That day is like my reset button, and I really don't see why I should give up that one chance at rest just so my 4-year-old, who honestly doesn't even know what she's missing yet, can play a sport she's probably not even ready for. She's got years ahead of her to pick up hobbies or join extracurriculars. Right now, all that enrolling her in soccer or t-ball or anything else would do is add one more stressor to my plate. The truth is, I'm stretched thin already. I can feel myself at full capacity. I don't have much left to give. And when I think about Saturday mornings turning into practices and games, dragging the baby along, worrying about heat or schedules, it just sounds like the fast track to burnout. My husband works weekends sometimes, so on those days, I'd be the one handling everything. And let's be real, I know myself. I'd probably flake or dread those mornings, which isn't fair to anyone. On top of that, we live in a very hot state. The idea of spending extra hours outside in the blazing sun with toddlers and a newborn is the exact opposite of appealing. My husband argues that our daughter needs this for athleticism and to make friends, but I think there are other ways to help her socialize. Playdates, preschool, even just being around extended family, those feel like more natural options without locking us into a weekly commitment that eats up our only day of rest. Of course, the in-laws don't see it that way. They've made it clear they agree with my husband. From their perspective, I'm being unfair and maybe even holding her back. My own family takes a softer stance. They don't think sports are essential at 4 years old, but they do admit she would probably enjoy it. So I'm stuck between people telling me I'm depriving her of something and others telling me it's not really that big of a deal. Here's the update though. My daughter ended up enrolled in soccer. Believe it or not, I do have a supportive circle. My husband and in-laws stepped in to help, which made it feel a lot less overwhelming. And while I still think it's fair to call myself a little selfish, I also know that selfishness sometimes comes from self-preservation. If I push myself past burnout, I can't show up as the mom, teacher, wife, or even just person I need to be. Rest is not a luxury, it's a need. And if protecting my Saturdays was a way to make sure I stayed sane, I don't feel guilty about that. My kids deserve a mom who isn't running on fumes, but I decided to give soccer a try, and I'll keep it up if it works for the whole family, and if my daughter enjoys it. If she doesn't, then we'll move on. At the end of the day, I love my kids more than anything, but I also know my needs matter too. That's where this story ends. This one really shows how tricky it can be to balance personal limits with outside expectations. I get why wanting just one day to yourself feels huge when life is already packed nonstop. And honestly, it's refreshing to hear someone admit they're selfish sometimes, without beating themselves up about it. It feels real, because everyone has a breaking point, and being upfront about it takes honesty. This next story is about a young couple whose boundaries were pushed to the limit when a sister-in-law started walking into their house uninvited and even helped herself to their belongings. I'm 21, living with my boyfriend who's 22, and we've built a little home together. It's nothing extravagant, but it's ours, and that alone makes it feel special. His younger sister, though, she's 17, seems to think that because her brother lives here, she's entitled to come and go as she pleases. And honestly, that's where things started spiraling. One night, it was late, around 11:30. My boyfriend and I had already gone to bed. Out of nowhere, his sister let herself in, waking him up in the process. She asked if she could take a beer from our fridge. He told her no, thinking that would be the end of it. Instead, she threw a tantrum, slamming the bathroom door before storming back out. At least that's what we thought happened. He heard the front door slam once, locked it, and figured she'd left. We went back to bed. The next morning, I was unpacking groceries and opened the drawer where we keep alcohol. My heart sank, completely empty. Just 2 days earlier, I had bought a 24-pack of Seagrams. I'd only had one. The rest were gone. At first, I asked my boyfriend if he'd moved them somewhere else, but he hadn't. That's when it clicked. She'd asked for a drink, been told no, and clearly decided to take what she wanted anyway. When I confronted her, she came up with a story that didn't make sense. She said she'd only used the bathroom and that a friend must have slipped inside and grabbed the drinks while she was in there. But here's the thing. Our front door only closes if you slam it. We know for sure it only slammed once when she left. And if it had stayed open long enough for her friend to get in and out, my cat would have darted outside. The story just didn't add up. So I told her straight. I knew she was lying, and even if by some stretch she wasn't, then she had still let someone steal from us. Either way, it was selfish and disrespectful. She didn't take that well. She lashed out, called me names, said I was controlling my boyfriend, and even told me I wasn't family to her anymore. That last part hit me hard. I'd always been supportive of her. I'd been there through her breakups, through the messy times, and I genuinely thought we were close. But if she was going to treat me like an outsider the moment I got upset about being stolen from, then fine. I'd act accordingly. I went over to her dad's place and told him they'd need to find another way for her to do her schoolwork because I was taking back my computer. If I wasn't family, then she didn't need to be using my things. To my surprise, her dad was fine with that arrangement. Now she's doubling down. She's furious, telling my boyfriend he's dead to her for siding with me, saying I'm controlling, and sending us long, angry messages at 2 a.m. She claims I ruin every outing, that I've changed her brother, and that he never sticks up for her. The irony is, this was the first actual fight between us, and he only took my side because he was equally upset she'd crossed so many boundaries. His mom even told me she thinks I've changed him for the better, that I've made him happier, lighter, and more himself. In the end, we got a new door handle installed. Now I feel safer, and my belongings are secure. But the relationship with his sister, that might be broken for good. That's the end of this story. It's wild how quickly family dynamics can flip when boundaries get pushed. What really stands out to me here isn't just the missing drinks. It's the way things escalated once the word control got thrown around. It's almost like she couldn't admit being wrong, so she flipped the script entirely. And honestly, that kind of tension can linger long after the actual fight is over. This next story is about a husband and wife who clashed over whether to visit his oldest son or go on a trip with her friends, and the fallout it caused in their marriage. I've got 4 kids in total. My oldest is 19 from my first marriage, and then I have 3 more with my current wife, ages 13, 12, and 6. The 12-year-old is my only daughter. The rest are boys. My oldest has been studying overseas, and during summer break, he came back to the States. He had a 2-week stretch with no classes and no commitments, and during that time, he asked if we could come visit him. When he asked, I didn't hesitate. I told him yes. To me, it felt obvious. I don't get nearly enough time with him, and neither do his siblings, so the chance to see him during a downtime window seemed like a no-brainer. But when I told my wife, she wasn't happy. She said I shouldn't have committed without checking with her first. I told her we didn't have any plans, so I figured it was fine. She pushed back, saying I couldn't know that for sure, and if she had made plans without telling me, that would mean she committed without asking me too. That back and forth didn't go anywhere, so we let it drop. Or at least I thought we did. A little later, she told me that we had been invited on a trip with some of her friends. That trip would overlap with the time we'd set aside to visit my son. She said she wanted to go on that trip instead. I told her we already had plans. She told me she never agreed to those plans. So in her mind, they didn't count. And just like that, the fight picked up again. Eventually, I told her straight up. She could do whatever she wanted. But I was taking the kids to see their brother. I felt strongly that it mattered. He's an adult now, and soon enough, he's going to be living his own life with less time for family. Keeping that bond alive was important to me. She pushed back hard, saying I was being insensitive because she hates California, and I just assumed she'd be okay going there. I told her, fine. If she doesn't want to go, she doesn't have to. I'd take the kids myself. She didn't like that answer either, and things really started getting heated. To break the deadlock, I suggested we just ask the kids what they wanted. So we sat down and did exactly that. But when we asked, she really tried to sell her vacation idea and downplay the trip to California. Despite that, the kids still said they wanted to see their brother. Even after that, she wasn't happy. She still didn't want me taking them, but I stood firm. So the kids and I went. We flew out, spent the time with my oldest, and honestly, it was a fantastic trip. The kids got to spend time with their brother, we reconnected, and it felt worth every bit of the hassle leading up to it. But when we got back, things at home were different. My wife was cold toward me. She didn't yell or start fights, but the energy between us had shifted. Then last week, she dropped the bombshell. She wanted us to go to couples counseling. I agreed. We found someone, and we've got our first appointment scheduled for September. The thing is, I've been talking to my friends about it, and most of them, whether they're married or divorced, say counseling is a bad sign. They told me it means things are already on the rocks, and it's usually just the step before everything falls apart. That's been weighing on me. I can't stop thinking about it. Am I just going to walk in there and get roasted for what I did? I don't regret visiting my son, and I don't regret letting the kids see their brother, but I also don't want this marriage to fall apart. I love my wife. I love all of my kids. And all I really wanted was for them to have that time together and keep building that sibling bond while they're young. I just can't help wondering if that was too much to ask. That's where the story ends. This one feels heavy because it's not really about the trip. It's about the bigger picture of communication and priorities in a family. I get why it blew up though. When both people feel unheard, even small decisions turn into huge fights. It makes sense he's nervous about counseling too. It's tough to walk into something not knowing if it's going to fix things or break them down further. Sometimes all you can do is show up, be honest, and see where it goes. This next story is about a woman who's been with her boyfriend for 6 years and feels stuck as he keeps putting off an engagement, despite her wanting clear commitment. So here's where I'm at. My boyfriend and I have been together since we were teenagers. He's 24 now, and I'm 23. This July marks 6 years of us dating. 6 years. On paper, that sounds like a big milestone worth celebrating. And I do love him. He's my best friend, and we've grown up together in a lot of ways. But instead of feeling only excited, I also feel this heavy dread. Because for me, it's not just another anniversary. It's another year that's gone by without him proposing. When we first started dating, he was the one constantly talking about marriage. He would joke about marrying me all the time, saying it almost every day when we were 18. But then things shifted. Once we both entered the corporate world, his perspective became more cautious. He started saying we needed to be stable first, financially, career-wise, and in life. On some level, I understand that. Being responsible does matter. But what's been eating at me is how he always seems to prioritize new personal goals over committing to us. One day he's talking about moving into the city. The next day, it's a new car. Then it's travel plans. Meanwhile, marriage just keeps getting pushed further down the line. What makes it harder is that we don't live in a bubble. His sister got engaged last year, and of course we were both excited for her. But deep down, I couldn't help feeling frustrated with him. I noticed how genuinely happy he was for her, how he'd light up talking about their wedding. And then when people teased us, saying we were next, he would laugh it off or say, "Oh, we've got a long way to go." That stung, especially because he'd ask me questions about his sister's wedding, like what kind of dress I'd wear or whether I'd want a destination wedding. And all I could think was, why are you asking me these things when you've already made it clear you don't plan on proposing anytime soon? Recently, I brought it up again, telling him that I'd like us to get engaged soon. And that's when he dropped his so-called non-negotiable. He said flat out that he wouldn't propose unless we lived together first for at least a year. For me, that's a deal breaker. I grew up in a fairly traditional household, and even though I don't carry all my parents' values, one that stayed with me is waiting to move in together until we're at least engaged. He's always known that about me. I even suggested a compromise, that we could get engaged and then start looking for a place together afterward, but he just shut it down. No discussion, just no. That was the moment it really hit me. He's not willing to meet me halfway. I even asked him, "So if I don't move in with you for 3 more years, does that mean you won't propose for 3 years?" And he said yes. No compromise. No consideration for how I feel. Just a shrug. And it's not like I'm asking for a huge wedding or some expensive ring. I told him he could literally propose with a candy ring and I'd still say yes. Because to me, marriage isn't about the party. It's about the commitment. I've been putting effort into this relationship for years. I supported him financially at the beginning when he didn't have a job. I've been the one planning dates and trips. I even remind him of his doctor's appointments. And now that he's financially stable, he's buying new cars, booking trips, and making plans for himself. But when it comes to making a concrete step forward with me, he shuts down. The thing that really drives me crazy is this new little habit he's developed. He'll hold my hand and start measuring my ring finger, like he's pretending to guess my size. And honestly, it feels like a punch in the gut. It's cruel in a way, because he knows where I stand and what I want, but he still does it while telling me I shouldn't expect a proposal anytime soon. At this point, I don't know how to move forward. Our 6-year anniversary is coming up, and instead of being excited, I feel nervous and even a little sad. I don't want to beg him to propose, but I also don't want to keep waiting indefinitely while he keeps comparing us to his friends and family. I want a future with him, but it's hard to ignore how much he's changed and how little effort he seems to put in when it comes to me. That's the end of this story. This one really tugs at me because you can tell she's not asking for anything extravagant, just clarity and commitment. 6 years is a long time to feel like you're stuck in limbo. The mixed signals, like him measuring her ring finger, make it even more frustrating. It's one of those situations where the love is clearly there, but the balance feels off. Sometimes those mismatched timelines can be harder to navigate than people realize. This next story is about a roommate who feels stuck paying more than his share of rent, while also being pressured to live by rules that only benefit his friend's partner. So here's the situation I found myself in. I'm 25, and one of my best mates, let's call him Jack, recently moved in with me. At first it was supposed to be just the two of us, but the plan was that once Jack's partner Matt got their fiancée visa sorted, they'd move in as well. And when that happened, the rent would be split evenly 3 ways. That seemed fair to me, and I was on board with it. But after we'd already settled in, Jack casually mentioned that because the visa fees and legal costs had turned out to be more expensive than expected, he thought it would be better if we just kept rent at a 50-50 split. And for some reason, I agreed. Honestly, I'll admit I struggle with saying no to people I care about. I don't like conflict, and in the moment, I just went along with it. Now though, I'm realizing how much of a strain this setup is becoming. The cost of living keeps going up, and I don't think it's sustainable for me to keep covering half the rent when there are going to be 3 adults living here. Sure, I didn't mind for a short stretch. My girlfriend stayed with me for a month recently while sorting out her own place, so paying 50-50 made sense during that time. But long term, it just doesn't feel right. And here's the kicker. From what I've gathered, as soon as Matt heard that I agreed to the 50-50 deal, they quit their job. I guess the reasoning was that since I'd already taken on that extra cost, they didn't need to stress about working right away. The problem is, even when they are allowed to work, they've made it clear they only want very specific types of jobs. Nothing customer-facing, nothing in an office. So it could be a while before they're contributing financially, and in the meantime, I'm the one helping cover the gap. On top of the money issue, living here has started to feel more and more stifling. Jack has a very particular way of keeping the place. He wants everything spotless at all times, cupboards closed, dishes never left overnight, no clutter anywhere. I'm not messy by any means, but I'm more relaxed about it. To me, leaving a teacup on the counter overnight isn't the end of the world. But Jack has been really firm about me following his system, and he keeps saying it's because Matt has OCD and clutter can trigger them. I get that, and I want to be respectful, but it's starting to feel like I'm molding my entire lifestyle around making Matt comfortable when Matt isn't even officially contributing yet. Then there's Jack himself. He constantly asks me where I'm going, what I'm doing, when I'll be home. I'm a pretty spontaneous person. I like being able to just head out and see where the day takes me. Jack's more of a homebody, and maybe that plays into it, but the constant check-ins are exhausting. It's gotten to the point where I sometimes feel like I'm living with a warden instead of a friend. So here I am, stuck paying more rent than feels fair, living under stricter rules than I'm comfortable with, and trying to figure out how I ended up in this situation. I moved in thinking I was sharing a flat with a mate, but now it feels like I'm paying extra to help his partner live here while also shaping my whole lifestyle around them. And the question I keep asking myself is, Would I be the bad guy if I pulled back from the 50-50 deal and said the rent needs to be split 3 ways once Matt moves in? That's where the story ends. I think what makes this situation tricky is how it shifted after the fact. Agreeing to one setup and then having the ground rules change underneath, you can really throw things off. It's not just about the money, it's also about how comfortable you feel in your own home. When those two things collide, it's no wonder it starts to feel suffocating. Sometimes what feels like a small compromise at the start can grow into something way bigger than you expected. This next story is about someone who faced a terrifying scare when the dog they planned to adopt nearly died, and how an unexpected moment with nature gave them comfort in the middle of it all. Last week, I went through one of the scariest moments I've had in a long time. The dog I'm planning to adopt, a sweet pup I've already grown so attached to, got into some dangerous pills at her foster home. Her foster, who is very experienced and has seen plenty of emergencies before, was convinced she wasn't going to make it. Hearing that crushed me in a way I wasn't even prepared for. It hit me just how much I already loved this dog. The thought of losing her before she even officially became part of my family absolutely gutted me. I don't really consider myself religious, and I don't believe in much beyond what I can see. But in that moment, I felt like I had to do something. Pray, or talk, or just reach out in some way. So I went outside to the part of the yard where my other dogs are buried. I still have 2 living with me, but the 4 that passed over the years, they're the ones who shaped so much of my life. They're the OGs, the ones I'll never get over, no matter how much time goes by or how many pets I have. I sat down by their graves and just broke down. I was crying harder than I had in a long time, talking to them out loud, begging them to somehow keep this pup safe. It felt desperate, almost childish, but in that moment, I didn't care. I just needed to say it, needed to release it, and that's when something strange happened. The crows came. I've been feeding the neighborhood crows for a while, and usually they'll show up at predictable times for food. But this was different. 3 of them landed in a tree right above me, the same 3 I tend to see the most. They weren't making their usual calls. It wasn't the sharp alarm cry they make when a hawk is around. It was this odd mix of sounds, almost worried, almost confused. I'd never heard them vocalize like that before. It felt like they knew I was upset. They didn't fly off or ignore me like birds usually do when humans act out of the ordinary. They stayed. They perched right above me, watching, calling out in this unusual way while I cried and talked to my dogs. I thanked them out loud, told them how much it meant that they came, and they didn't leave until I finally stood up and headed back inside. I can't explain it. They're just birds, right? But in that moment, I felt more seen and more cared for than I had in a long time. It wasn't like they understood every word, but they knew something was wrong. They chose to stay with me while I sat there, and that choice mattered to me. Honestly, it was beautiful. And the best part, the pup made it. She pulled through. When I heard she was okay, I thought back to that moment with the crows, how I'd even begged them along with my dogs to help somehow. I know it sounds wild to connect the two, but I can't help being open to the idea that maybe, in some strange way, they were part of it. That's the end of this story. It's amazing how sometimes comfort shows up in the least expected way, like from the crows outside your house. Whether or not it meant anything beyond coincidence, it clearly made that moment a little easier to carry. And honestly, that kind of presence is something a lot of people wish they had more often. This next story is about someone whose mother abandoned them as a child and then suddenly tried to come back into their life years later, expecting everything to be forgiven. When I was 12 years old, my mom walked out on me and my dad. There was no fight, no big dramatic moment, not even an explanation. She just packed up her bags, left with her new boyfriend, and that was it. From that day forward, there were no calls, no letters, no birthday cards, no attempts at contact, just silence. My dad was the one who stayed. He became both parents for me, and I watched him work himself to the bone just to make sure I had what I needed. He juggled 2 jobs, often came home completely exhausted, and still managed to show up for me. He was there at every school concert, every sports game, every parent-teacher meeting. Looking back now, I realize how much he sacrificed, but at the time all I knew was that he was the one constant I could rely on. He never let me feel unloved, even though there was this massive hole where my mom should have been. One of the hardest memories from that time happened in middle school. I had just won this big award, and the ceremony was supposed to be this exciting celebration. Every kid around me had both parents there, taking pictures, hugging them, making the moment feel special. I remember standing there with just my dad, trying to smile and act proud, but deep down I felt that empty space. It hit me harder than ever that day. No matter how important the moment was, she wasn't coming back. For years after she left, I cried myself to sleep wondering why I wasn't enough for her to stay. I kept hoping maybe she'd change her mind. Maybe she'd show up one day and apologize, but that day never came. Eventually, I had to stop waiting. I built walls around myself, convincing myself I didn't need her, because holding on to that hope was hurting more than letting it go. Fast forward 15 years, and out of nowhere, she reaches out to me. She sends this message saying she's sorry, that she misses me, and she wants to be part of my life again. Like the past decade and a half never happened. Like she could just step back in and pick up where she left off. I told her no. I said I didn't want to rebuild a relationship after everything, especially when she chose to walk away and then made no effort to return. Her response was to cry and accuse me of being cruel and heartless. On top of that, some extended family I barely even talked to started pressuring me. They told me I should be the bigger person, that I should give her a second chance because life's too short. But the truth is, she feels like a complete stranger to me now. I don't know her anymore. She wasn't there when I needed her the most, and I've built my life without her. Still, there's this small part of me, deep down, that wonders if I'll regret closing the door on her forever. That's where the story ends. That's such a tough spot to be in. On one hand, it makes sense not to let someone back in just because they suddenly decided to show up again. On the other hand, I get how the thought of what if can stick in your head and be hard to shake. Honestly, feelings like that aren't simple or clean cut, and it's okay to sit with the uncertainty without having all the answers. This next story is about a former manager who never thought they made much of an impact, only to be surprised years later when an old teammate reached out during one of the biggest moments of her life. Back when I was working on a 6-month contract, I managed a small team. It wasn't permanent, and I went into it knowing that. Contracting can feel like this revolving door. You come in, you build relationships, but more often than not, those connections fade quickly once the work is over. Still, during that time, I got along with the team. We were friendly, and I felt like I'd made a few meaningful bonds. When the contract ended, though, things fizzled out pretty fast. I told myself that was just the way it went. Nothing lasting, nothing that would stick. Almost 2 years later, completely out of the blue, my phone rang. I was sitting in a coffee shop with my laptop open, working, when I saw a name flash across my work phone that I didn't expect. It was one of the women from that team. I closed my laptop, picked up the call, and immediately heard the tremor in her voice. She told me she had just found out she was pregnant. She was standing in a bathroom, and I couldn't quite read if she was excited, terrified, or both. My instincts kicked in right away. I went into what I call mom mode. I asked her how we were feeling about it, not just her, but the whole situation. I got her to try box breathing over the phone. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. I reminded her that it was entirely her choice, that she was a grown woman, married, with a strong career, and whatever path she wanted to take was valid. She wasn't in trouble. If she wanted this to be good news, it could be. If not, there was no judgment. I just held that space for her. I stayed on the line while she sat down right there on the bathroom floor, and for a moment I could hear every detail. The quiet echo of the room, the muffled sound of her breathing, the drop of silence between us. Then it all came out. She burst out laughing and crying at the same time, saying, "Oh my God, I'm so excited. I'm going to have a baby." I couldn't help but cheer back. "Congratulations. You're going to be such a good mom." That moment felt like pure light over the phone. Months passed and she called me again. This time it wasn't so out of nowhere. We'd reconnected by then, and she had my personal number. Still, her tone was a little sheepish when she admitted something. She said, "I actually told you before I told my husband." My brain just went, "I need support. I need an adult." And the next thing I knew, I was calling you. That line stuck with me in a way I can't even explain. Out of all the people in her life, I was the one her brain picked in that split second of panic and joy. She needed support, and she thought of me. If I could put anything on my gravestone, I think it'd be that. And now, years later, I can say she is a wonderful mom. I saw her just the other day, holding her healthy little boy, smiling in a way that carried both peace and chaos, the real markers of parenthood. Watching them together made me realize that those fleeting connections we think don't matter sometimes end up leaving the deepest marks. That's where the story ends. That's such a surprisingly touching story. It's funny how you can go years thinking you didn't really matter to someone, and then they show you just how much space you held in their life. I love that mix of panic and joy on the bathroom floor, turning into excitement. It's the kind of detail that makes a memory feel permanent. This next story is about an IT team forced to work on the 4th of July by a VP who didn't respect them, only for things to spiral into the most expensive office party the company had ever seen. It all started when I got an email from a vice president who wasn't even over my department. She told me my team would be required to work on July 4th. I pushed back politely, explaining that we'd already scheduled the day off and that people had made plans. But if you've ever worked in IT, you know, it's the department that always gets shafted. I kept my team updated throughout the week, telling them I was reaching out to higher-ups to try to fix it. I promised that if their holiday plans got ruined, I'd make it right somehow. After 3 meetings, it was looking like nothing would change. So I escalated it to the CEO. Everyone supported that decision because he's very family-oriented, but the timing couldn't have been worse. He was on vacation in the Bahamas until July 6th. His assistant told me he'd look at it afterward. At that point, I figured we'd just work from home. I even set up call routing, so most support requests would hit my cell phone. I honestly expected almost no calls anyway. And as for that notice they wanted me to send out saying it would be available, I never sent it. Then came the kicker. I was told not only did my team have to work, but we weren't allowed to do it from home. They were going to check badge scans at the office to make sure we showed up. When I asked why, I was told it was to stop us from playing video games. Mind you, we usually worked from home 2/3 of the week, and gaming in the office was already normal. So I went to this VP's office to talk. After a long back and forth where she was running out of logic, she dropped the line that floored me. "It's just it. You guys don't have lives." I reported that to my own VP. He just told me, "I'll handle this later. For now, get creative." And I knew exactly what that meant. I emailed back asking if we could at least throw an office party since we were being forced in. She said yes, as long as it didn't interfere with calls. She even told me to use my company credit card and said, "Go wild." That was her mistake. I pulled the team together and asked what they had planned for the holiday. A couple had fireworks lined up, others had barbecues with family. I told them to go ahead and invite their families to the office instead because I was taking care of everything. No one needed to bring a thing. The 4th rolled around and we did 0 actual work. Only 7 calls came in, all from the bad VP checking on us. By evening, I rolled out the surprise. A catered feast. Not just hot dogs and burgers, but full smoked brisket, ribs, sausage, turkey, sides like potato salad and green beans, pizzas from 2 different restaurants, custom cakes, pies, cookies, and fudge. Families and friends showed up. Kids ran around. My VP even brought water balloons for them. Out back, once it got dark, we crossed the little footbridge behind the office, which conveniently crossed into another county, and set off fireworks. By the time the night ended, no one had touched a single IT ticket. We'd eaten until we were stuffed, sent leftovers home, and spent the holiday together like we should have in the first place. The bad VP called one more time around 7:50. I told her, "Well, you're the only one who called today. The rest of us are on the patio enjoying the shindig." She said she didn't care as long as there was no alcohol or fireworks on company property, which technically there weren't. The next morning, I submitted the expense report. The final total? Over $6,000. That party was more expensive than some executive dinners the CEO had hosted. When the CEO got back, he was furious. Not at me, but at the fact IT had been singled out to work, while other departments stayed home. He blasted the higher-ups in a company-wide email about respecting holidays and work-life balance. The bad VP ended up getting chewed out so badly she sent me an apology. Last I heard, she either lost her position or her influence, because she hasn't been seen since. And funnily enough, there's no more pushback against remote work for us anymore. That's the end of this story. That was such a satisfying chain of events. The detail that cracked me up was the VP saying, "Go wild." like that wouldn't backfire immediately. The fact that it turned into the priciest party in company history makes it even better. What also stood out was how calm and methodical it all was. Every move was technically within the rules, just used in the smartest way possible. And the part where the CEO got mad at management instead of the IT team, that's just the perfect ending. Sometimes the best revenge doesn't come from breaking rules, but from following them a little too well. This next story is about a strict supermarket manager who threatened to fire an employee for calling in sick, only for that decision to completely backfire in the best way. Back when I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I had a solid track record there. I was always on time, usually showed up early, and I rarely ever called in sick. In fact, the last time I'd been sent home ill was almost 9 months earlier, and even then, my manager had made that call, not me. One night, though, I came down with something rough. I was running a fever that kept swinging from burning hot to freezing cold, and I was stuck throwing up over and over again. At one point around 2 in the morning, I was sitting on the toilet with my head resting in the sink, so weak I must have passed out right there. The next thing I knew, it was 7 in the morning. My shift was due to start at noon, and there was no way I was going to make it in. So I called my manager, Steve. He was already known for being difficult. He never believed staff when they called in sick, though he had no problem taking sick days himself, often when everyone knew he was just hungover. The conversation went exactly how you'd expect. I told him I was too sick to come in, that I'd been throwing up and had a fever. His response? He barked that if I really had the flu, I'd be completely knocked out, and he needed me in regardless. He told me flat out, either come in or bring a doctor's note, or I was fired. Now, in the UK, you're legally allowed to self-certify for up to 5 days without needing a doctor's note. It's actually illegal for an employer to demand one during that period. I knew this, but I was terrified of losing my job. The recession was still hitting hard, and I couldn't afford to be unemployed. So I pushed myself to get dressed, nearly passing out again in the process, and walked 25 minutes to the doctor's office. When I got there, the doctor was furious with me. You're not supposed to come in for colds or flu since there's not much they can do for you, and all it does is risk spreading it to other patients. But when I explained the situation with Steve, her anger shifted toward him. She asked if I received sick pay, and when I said yes, she told me she'd make sure he got the note he asked for. Except it wasn't the note Steve was expecting. Instead of a simple confirmation, she wrote that I'd been forced to attend the surgery because my manager illegally demanded it. She listed that I had a fever of 39 degrees Celsius, had nearly passed out, and that because of being forced to make this trip, I was being signed off for a full 2 weeks. She added that if I'd been allowed to self-certify as the law intended, I probably would have only needed a few days. When I brought the note in, one of the duty managers took one look at me and insisted on helping me down to Steve's office. I handed him the paper. He looked pale and immediately backpedaled, saying he hadn't been serious about firing me. The duty manager wasn't having it. They actually ended up driving me home themselves and later reported everything to our union rep. Steve got called into a disciplinary hearing where he tried to deny what happened, but the duty manager confirmed that he'd admitted to threatening me. He ended up with a severe reprimand and a final warning. Meanwhile, I spent a few days resting up, then enjoyed the rest of my fully paid 2 weeks off in the nice weather. And to make it even sweeter, Steve had to cover overtime because we were short-staffed, all because he pushed me for a doctor's note I didn't legally need. That story wraps up here. That one really stood out. It's wild how the manager's own stubbornness turned a couple of sick days into a 2-week paid break. The part that made me laugh was him trying to claim he wasn't serious after getting caught. It's the exact opposite of what a tough guy act sounds like. I also liked how the doctor handled it. Instead of just signing a quick note, she made sure it hit him where it hurt. And the image of him stuck doing overtime while you were at home recovering in the sunshine is just the perfect ending. This next story is about a neighbor who constantly blocks someone's garage, leading to late-night confrontations, intimidation tactics, and finally, a tow truck showdown. When I first moved into my new apartment, I thought the biggest challenge would be unpacking all my boxes. Instead, it turned out to be my neighbor. The building had 10 units, with individual garages lined up in the alley behind us. I had a 1-bedroom unit with my own garage, and right on that first day, I met someone who called herself La Crystal. She didn't even say hello before pointing to the space in front of my garage and telling me, I park there. I was caught off guard. I asked why she didn't use her own garage, and she casually explained that hers was already taken up by some old broken down car. She then handed me her number and said, "Just call me if you need me to move." At first, I didn't want to start drama with a new neighbor, so I just went along with it. But it didn't take long for the whole arrangement to become a nightmare. I had to leave for work around 4 in the morning, and half the time her car was in the way. I'd call her, wait 10 minutes, and she still wouldn't come out. If I called again, she'd scream into the phone that she was already on her way. Sometimes I'd come home late at night and couldn't even get into my own garage because she was blocking me again. After a while, I had enough. I asked her directly to stop parking there, but she wouldn't listen. Since the property owner was a buddy of mine, I finally told him what was going on. He responded by putting up signs warning that any car blocking garages would be towed. Sure enough, one night I came home with my girlfriend, and there she was, parked right in front of my garage again. I called her 3 times, and every time she sent me straight to voicemail. When I walked by her unit, I could actually hear her inside, talking trash about me. At that point, I didn't bother arguing. I called the tow truck, and her car was hauled away. The next morning, while I was at work, my girlfriend called to say La Crystal was standing outside my window, loudly ranting on the phone about how some guy in a 1-bedroom had her car towed, and how I supposedly owed her $300. When I got home later, she was in the courtyard with this creepy grin plastered on her face. She greeted me sweetly, like she was trying to play some game, then got back on her phone, saying I better pay up if I wanted to keep breathing. Not long after, she brought over a guy, probably her boyfriend. He was huge, even bigger than me, and I'm no small guy. Every time I stepped outside, he'd come out too, just staring me down in silence. We never said a word to each other, but it was clear what he was there for. I didn't give in, though. I never paid her a cent, and the funniest part, just a few days later, she got towed again, this time for blocking somebody else's garage. The property owner, who also happened to be driving by, saw it himself and made the call. That story wraps up here. Man, that escalated way beyond a simple parking issue. It's wild how something so small, just moving a car, turned into intimidation, threats, and tow trucks. What stood out to me was how casual she acted. Like blocking a garage was completely normal. Then to flip it and demand money after getting towed? That's just baffling. Honestly, the patience it must have taken not to blow up earlier is impressive. Sometimes you just have to let the consequences play out on their own. This next story is about a grocery store parking lot confrontation where a careless driver claimed to have left kids in a hot car, only to end up facing some serious consequences. A few years back, I had my whole crew with me, my pregnant wife and 3 kids, as we stopped at H-E-B for groceries. Anyone who's ever shopped with a family like that knows it feels like moving a circus into the store. It was summer in Texas, so the heat was brutal. Outside, it was already pushing 95 degrees, and inside a car with the windows rolled up, it could easily feel like 130 or more. The parking lot was packed, and we were inching down the row looking for a spot when some guy in the opposite lane suddenly darted ahead and snagged the expectant mother or with children space. I couldn't help but think what a selfish move that was. We ended up parking farther down the row, which meant wrangling the kids through a busy lot while also pushing the stroller. By the time we got out and started walking toward the store, the guy finally stepped out of his car. What struck me was how it took him a solid 5 minutes to get out after rushing into that spot. As he passed by us, I said, while pushing the stroller, "Hey, that parking is really for pregnant women or families with small kids." Without missing a beat, he waved it off and said, "Yeah, the kids are in the car," in this dismissive tone like it was no big deal. That stopped me for a second. I played along, but pointed out, "It's too hot for anyone to be left in a car without air conditioning. That's not safe." He brushed me off again and muttered, "They'll be fine. Don't worry about it." That was the last straw for me. My wife and I were already trying to keep 2 kids from running into traffic and pushing another in a stroller across extra distance, and here's this guy basically admitting he left kids in a roasting car. As we walked inside, I noticed a manager standing near the entrance. I told her exactly what the man had said, word for word, and I pointed him out. I made it clear I hadn't looked into his car myself, but I thought someone needed to know. In Texas, leaving kids or pets in cars isn't just careless. It can turn deadly in under 15 minutes. And HEB isn't the type of place to let something like that slide. They've got a reputation for caring about the community, and there's usually a police officer on site just in case. All I did was pass along what the man told me. Nothing more. His own words were enough to bring attention to the situation. The manager thanked me and said they'd look into it, and I went about our shopping with my family. Roughly 25 minutes later, we came back outside with our groceries, and there he was. The same guy, now standing beside his car, animatedly talking to a constable. The officer didn't look impressed at all. His face had that firm, disapproving expression, like he'd already heard enough excuses. As I loaded our groceries, I couldn't help but smile to myself and think back to what he told me earlier. They'll be fine. Don't worry about it. That story ends there. That's such a wild chain of events from something as simple as a parking spot. What stuck with me is how casually the guy said he left kids in the car, like it was no big deal. It's almost unbelievable someone would even say that out loud, especially in Texas heat. The ending was kind of poetic too. Seeing him stuck, explaining himself to a cop while the storyteller just walked away. Sometimes people really do trap themselves with their own words. This next story is about divorced parents locked in a custody battle where personal property kept going missing, and one parent had to draw the line when their ex refused to return it. My ex-wife and I share custody of our 3 kids equally. We split the time right down the middle, and no child support is paid either way. The marriage itself ended pretty badly, so we only communicate when absolutely necessary, and that's through a parenting app. She's remarried now, and in her household, she's also raising 2 stepkids. For a while, things seemed manageable, but then issues started popping up with my personal property. It began with an old cell phone. I gave my oldest my phone after one of her stepkids broke theirs. Instead of letting our child keep it as intended, she told them the phone was staying at her house. When I asked for it back, she flat out refused. I even went over in person to get it, but she claimed she had every right to confiscate it. After following up in writing, she still told me she wasn't returning it and that I should just get over it. The next time it happened, it was with my tools. My daughter had borrowed them for a school project, but since it was a custody exchange day, she ended up at her mom's afterward. My ex decided it wasn't appropriate for her to have them, so she took the tools and refused to give them back. I made sure to document that one with a written exchange as well. And then came the breaking point. My youngest needed an old iPod for a class assignment about outdated tech. I lent him mine, simple enough, but apparently her 13-year-old stepkid had a similar assignment later on. She decided both kids should get to use the iPod, and once again, she told me she wasn't giving it back. At that point, I knew if I let it slide again, it would just keep happening. So I told her in writing to return it. When she refused, I called the police. She ended up handing everything back, but she completely blew up over it. She accused me of being spiteful, of making something petty into a bigger deal than it needed to be. She argued that I could have just waited until her stepkid was finished, and she claimed I was only doing this to be difficult. To me, it wasn't about being petty. It was about her repeatedly keeping things that didn't belong to her. What I give to my kids is for my kids. It's not meant for her stepkids. They have their own parents to provide for them. From my perspective, she crossed the line one too many times, and I wasn't going to let her keep my stuff anymore. That's where the story ends. What stood out here is how small items like phones or tools can turn into full-blown battles when there's history between 2 people. It's interesting how quickly the tone shifted once the police were involved. Suddenly, the things that were no big deal were handed back right away. I think the frustration comes from the pattern, not the individual items, and that's what made it escalate. It's one of those stories where you can feel how exhausting the back and forth must have been, especially when kids are caught in the middle of it. Sometimes the drama isn't about the thing itself, it's about respect, or the lack of it. This next story is about a neighbor dispute that started with petty complaints and eventually turned into a clever bit of payback during a backyard party. When I first moved into my house, I thought the biggest adjustments would be things like unpacking or fixing up the place. Instead, the real challenge turned out to be my backyard neighbor. Not long after I closed on the property, this was in late December, she came knocking in the early spring with demands. She wanted me to spend $10,000 building a dry well to stop rainwater from flowing downhill into her yard. The thing is, my property has been higher than hers for over 60 years. It's just the way the land sits. I told her no, but I did offer to let her cover the cost herself, if it mattered that much to her. Of course, she declined. That was just the beginning. A few weeks later, she called the town to complain about one of my floodlights. It was missing a cover, and she made it sound like a big violation. Code enforcement came by right in the middle of me hosting people, which was embarrassing, but the officer reassured me it wasn't a serious issue. He even mentioned she was already known for doing this sort of thing. I fixed the light, and when the inspector came back to check, he closed the case without any fines. Then came Father's Day. We had a small surprise gathering for my father-in-law's 80th birthday. We weren't blasting anything, just some music on a little Sonos speaker. A few days later, the same officer called me again. He said she'd complained, but not to worry about it. He did suggest that if I wanted to avoid future headaches, I should consider applying for a permit anytime I planned on playing music outside. Fast forward to mid-July. I was outside and overheard her on the phone, inviting people to a barbecue at her place and even mentioning the date and time. That gave me an idea. The following Monday, I went to town hall and applied for a noise permit covering that exact date and time. Sure enough, it got approved. When the day of her party rolled around, I was ready. As her guests started showing up, I cranked up some old Greek chanting music from the early 1900s. My grandparents used to play it nonstop when I was a kid, and I knew firsthand how grating it could get. Within minutes, she was at my door, pounding and ringing the bell over and over, completely losing it. The footage from my Ring doorbell caught the whole tantrum, and honestly, it was hilarious to watch back later. I didn't answer though. Instead, I went out with my wife and the neighbors on either side of me for drinks. By Monday, she had filed yet another complaint with code enforcement. The same officer showed up to handle it, but this time he let her know a permit had been issued. There was nothing she could do. That's where this story finishes. That one made me laugh. The timing of getting the permit right on her party day was just too perfect. What stood out was how much patience it must have taken to deal with all those earlier complaints without blowing up. And then when the chance came, using that permit in such a calm, calculated way, it's almost poetic. I also can't stop picturing that old Greek chanting blasting across the yard. That's such a random but brilliant choice. It's one of those rare moments where the comeback feels like it matched the situation perfectly. This next story is about a wedding where the maid of honor suddenly ghosted right before the big day, leaving the bride and her bridesmaids scrambling. I'm a bridesmaid in my friend Tara's wedding, and up until last week, everything seemed to be moving along pretty smoothly. Dresses were set, schedules were organized, and the vibe in our group chat was all excitement and planning. But then, out of nowhere, the maid of honor, Jess, went completely silent. It started last Thursday. Tara had messaged her asking to confirm a couple of simple things: her speech for the reception and the time she'd be at the rehearsal dinner. Nothing dramatic or last minute, but Jess never responded. We waited, thinking maybe she was just busy, but as the days went on, still nothing. No texts, no calls, not even an email. Her read receipts were on though, so we knew she was seeing everything and choosing not to reply. By Sunday, Tara was on edge. The biggest stress point was that Jess had the wedding veil. She had picked it up from the seamstress, and Tara didn't have a backup plan. For a while, we all assumed something serious must have happened. Maybe there was an emergency. So we held off and gave her space, trying not to jump to conclusions. Then Monday night came, and any hope of a reasonable explanation went out the window. Jess posted on Instagram. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dealing with a family crisis. She was at a cabin in the mountains, casually posing in yoga stances with a caption that read something like, "Disconnecting from drama and reconnecting with myself." A few of us even tried commenting to check in, but she deleted those comments almost instantly. And the part that really floored us? She wasn't there alone. She was with the same guy she had claimed she'd broken up with months ago. The same guy who had made things so uncomfortable at Tara's engagement party by hitting on her. It was almost surreal seeing it play out in real time. At that point, Tara was devastated, but had to keep moving forward. She asked me to step in and give the maid of honor speech. I said yes, of course, and I was genuinely honored. But the whole situation left me shaking my head. To completely vanish the week before your best friend's wedding, and then flaunt it online as some sort of self-care retreat? It just didn't make sense. And the wildest part, Jess never returned the veil. To this day, no one's heard a word from her. That story wraps up here. That one really left me kind of stunned. It's one thing to back out of wedding duties, but disappearing with the bride's veil? That's on another level. The way she framed it like some self-care getaway while the wedding was falling apart behind her, that contrast really stood out. What got me too was how quick she was to delete comments, like she didn't want to be called out. It's messy, but also kind of fascinating how people can rewrite the narrative in real time. Weddings already come with enough stress, and then something like this just drops in out of nowhere. This next story is about a breakup where one partner was left wondering if they still owed favors to their ex, even after being hurt by how things ended. Before last Wednesday, my girlfriend and I had been together for a little over 3 years. For most of that time, we managed a bit of distance. She was living in Georgia, about 2 hours away from me in South Carolina. Things shifted in August when she moved up to New York for graduate school. Wanting to be closer, I found a new job and moved to DC. To be honest, things had already been a bit rough leading up to that point. The stress of moving, her starting grad school, and me adjusting to a new job added more weight on top of what was already shaky ground. Then last Monday, she brought up something I wasn't expecting. On the phone, she told me she wasn't sure if she still wanted to be in the relationship. She admitted she felt this pull to go out, date other people, and see what else was out there. I told her straight up that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted us to push through the hard times together, but she insisted that if she didn't follow through with this urge, even if things got better between us, she'd regret not exploring it. That's where we left it. The very next day, though, she reached out again. This time, she said she wanted to come down for Thanksgiving break, to spend a few days together in South Carolina before heading home to see her family. But there were strings attached. I'd have to drive 2 hours out to an airport in North Carolina to pick her up, then 2 hours back. A few days later, I'd need to drive her down to Georgia to her family and then back home. And then, after Thanksgiving, I'd have to go to Georgia again, pick her up, and drive with her all the way to DC, where she'd catch her flight back to New York. I remember asking why she wanted to go through all of this after what she just said about dating other people. She told me she thought maybe one positive experience together could help reset things. She even had the flight page pulled up, ready to book. I told her I wanted to talk it through more, but she went ahead and booked it anyway. The following day, I tried to bring up her desire to see other people and how we could actually fix things. Instead of finding middle ground, the conversation ended with her breaking up with me. Since then, she's barely responded to my texts. And when she has, it's been short and pretty harsh. When I pointed that out, she told me it was unreasonable to expect friendliness right after a breakup. Honestly, I couldn't argue with that. She was probably right. But then she texted again, this time telling me she still needed me to do all that driving for her trip, picking her up, taking her to her family, and then riding back with me after the holiday. She said she couldn't afford to change her flight and didn't have anyone else to rely on. I told her I didn't feel like I owed her that anymore. She argued that I had already committed to it, which is technically true. I asked if she could at least try to be friendly if I did help her, and she told me the best she could do was be cordial. She even said she'd probably just sit in the back and work the entire ride. So now I'm stuck wondering, do I really owe her this? Or is it selfish to tell her she needs to figure it out on her own? That's where the story ends. That one really leaves you sitting in the gray area. What stood out to me was how quickly the situation flipped, going from talk of breaking up to booking a whole holiday trip together, and then back to a breakup within days. It's also pretty striking how she expected all those rides, even after cutting things off. I found it interesting how she said she'd just sit in the back and work, like it was more of a business transaction than spending time together. It makes you realize how tangled responsibilities can feel right after a long relationship ends. This next story is about a small business owner who got flooded with wrong number calls for a doctor's office and found a clever way to solve the problem once the doctor refused to help. Several years back, my friend Mark started a home-based computer software business. He and his wife had been living in their house for about a decade, and by then, their phone number was well established in the community. This was in that transitional time when cell phones were just starting to get popular, but most people still relied on their landlines. To fit his schedule and his customers' needs, Mark set his business hours from 2 in the afternoon until 10 at night. That way, when people finished their own workdays, they could call him without interruption. and since most computer repairs still had to be done in person, folks could drop off their devices after work and pick them up from his back porch the next morning. It was a system that worked smoothly, at least at first. Then a new doctor moved to town and opened up a practice. The issue was the doctor's phone number differed from Mark's by just one single digit. Where Mark's number had a 3, the doctor's had an 8. At first it was just the occasional misdial, and Mark would politely redirect the caller. But as the practice grew, the calls kept coming in more and more often. Since the doctor was getting referrals from hospitals, Mark's phone started ringing around the clock. Patients would call after hours to reach the on-call doctor, and hospital staff would call trying to reach medical personnel. It got to the point where Mark had to unplug the phone just to eat lunch in peace or to get some sleep at night. And with 3 daughters out dating, that was not exactly a comfortable situation. Mark finally called the doctor's office to ask if they would consider changing their number. His reasoning was simple. He'd had his phone for years, and his family needed some peace and quiet. But the doctor brushed him off, saying it was too expensive to reprint stationery, business cards, and signage, and it would be a hassle to update medical registries and hospital records. The doctor basically told him, "Too bad, just deal with it. The calls will slow down eventually." Mark didn't argue. Instead, he cheerfully said, "Okie dokie, I'll do my best to take care of things." And that's when he came up with a plan. From then on, Mark personally answered every wrong number call as if he were the doctor's office. If someone said they had the sniffles from working in the yard, he'd respond, "You'd better come right in." If someone mentioned a little cough when smoking, he'd tell them, "Come on in." Even something as simple as a temperature of 98.9, he'd treat like it needed immediate attention. Parents calling about physicals for their kids, he'd promise they could all be seen together that same day. He never turned anyone away and made plenty of appointments, including 6 different routine checkups all at the same time slot on one Friday afternoon. It didn't take long for the chaos to hit the doctor's office. By Monday morning, the doctor himself called Mark, practically begging him to stop. Mark told him calmly, "I will, if you will." By the end of the week, the doctor's practice had a brand new phone number. That's where the story ends. That was a perfect example of creative problem solving. What really stood out was how Mark didn't argue or fight. He just flipped the situation back on the doctor in such a calm, almost playful way. The image of patients showing up for 6 simultaneous checkups made me laugh. It's interesting how something as small as a single digit in a phone number created such chaos. And the fact that it only took a couple of days of appointments for the doctor to finally cave says a lot. Sometimes the smartest payback is the simplest. This next story is about a neighbor who tried to claim ownership of a property line, only to find out the truth left him with far less yard than he thought. This happened years ago, but I still remember it clearly. When we first moved into this neighborhood, the houses were pretty close together. The kitchen windows lined up in a way that made it feel like our neighbors could just look straight in. My parents wanted more privacy, so they invested in a row of plants that cost thousands of dollars. It wasn't cheap, but they thought it would be worth it for the peace of mind. Just a week later, my parents woke up to find every single plant cut down. My dad was furious. He marched straight over to the neighbor's house to confront him. The neighbor claimed the plants were on his property line, so he said he had every right to remove them. He even went so far as to threaten that if anything crossed onto his property again, he'd report us to the authorities. Later that day, my dad called the landscaping company. Luckily, the plants were under warranty, so they agreed to replant them the following week at no cost. This time, we were extra careful to make sure they were entirely on our side of the property. Everything should have been settled, but a few nights later, around 2 a.m, we caught the neighbor chopping them down again. That time, we called the police and reported it as destruction of property. The neighbor didn't take it well, but after that, he finally agreed to call in a professional to officially mark the property line. My dad agreed too, just to put the whole issue to rest. A few days later, I came home to find bright orange tape marking the boundaries, and that's when it all came crashing down on the neighbor. His fence wasn't even close to the property line. It was 11 feet over onto our land. We watched as he had to take the entire fence down, looking completely furious the whole time. Within a month, we had our plants back in place. Our backyard felt more private than ever, and we gained 11 extra feet of space that had technically been ours all along. As for the neighbor, he not only lost about a quarter of his backyard, but he was also hit with a bill of nearly $10,000 for the damage he caused to our property. Meanwhile, we ended up with exactly what we wanted: our plants, our privacy, and even more yard than before. That's where this story finishes. That was one of those situations where pushing too hard totally backfired. The fact that he went out at 2 in the morning to chop the plants down just makes it even pettier. What stood out to me most was how his win turned into losing a whole chunk of his yard and getting stuck with a massive bill. And honestly, I can imagine how satisfying it must have been to watch those orange boundary markers go up and see the truth come out. Sometimes karma doesn't take long at all. This next story is about an employee dealing with an overbearing supervisor who nitpicked everything until a simple act of pettiness completely flipped the office dynamic. When I started this job a few months back, I quickly realized my supervisor, let's call him Josh, was the type who couldn't help but micromanage. Every little thing I did seemed to invite criticism. I tried to handle it professionally, asking him directly what his expectations were and what exactly I should be doing differently. But his answers were always vague, usually something like, just do better. At one point, I even had to sit down with HR and Josh to try to address the issue. Nothing came of it. He kept nitpicking without offering anything constructive. Then yesterday, he took things a step further. He came to my desk and told me I needed to dress better. Now, here's the thing. Our office is extremely casual. People wear jeans, hoodies, t-shirts, even baseball caps. Meanwhile, I never wear hats, and I always make a point to wear collared button-up shirts with chinos or dress slacks. On the day in question, I had on a long-sleeve flannel, chinos, and Adidas sneakers. Not exactly sloppy. So I asked him for specifics. Should I be wearing dress shoes? A tucked-in shirt? What exactly did he want me to change? His answer, the same as always. Vague. Just dress better. And then he told me to talk to HR for clarification. So I did. HR gave me the basic rundown. Pants, closed-toe shoes, no sleeveless shirts. Nothing I'd ever worn had been a problem. They flat out told me I was fine. At that point, I was frustrated and ready to make a point. So this morning, I showed up in a full suit, tailored, sharp, the kind of thing I usually save for weddings. It was ridiculously overdressed compared to everyone else in the office. People immediately started asking what the occasion was. Whenever someone asked, I told them honestly, I'd been told to dress better. That was always met with disbelief, and a couple of people even said they liked the way I normally dressed. When folks asked who had made that call, I told them it was Josh. I figured I'd keep this going for a week, just to highlight how absurd it was. But by the afternoon, the whole office seemed to know. Word got around so fast that the CEO himself stopped by my desk. He told me that from now on, I'd be reporting directly to him, and that he'd be having a conversation with Josh about this and other issues. Since I was Josh's only direct report, that basically meant Josh was no longer a supervisor at all, just another employee. I walked out that day on a bit of a high, and honestly, tomorrow I think I'll just throw on one of my regular flannels again. That's the end of this story. That one was hilarious in the best way. The image of everyone showing up casual and then you rolling in with a wedding suit just to make a point is priceless. What surprised me most is how fast it escalated all the way to the CEO. Like, one little stunt, and suddenly Josh lost his only bit of authority. It's funny how sometimes the smallest acts of pettiness end up being the most effective. And I have to say, the idea of going back to flannels right after is the perfect finishing touch. This next story is about a new employee in a security team who refused to follow one of the most basic rules, locking his computer, and quickly found out what happens when you ignore it. I've worked in computer security for a long time, and one of the golden rules in the field is simple. Always lock your computer when you step away. It doesn't matter if you're an accountant, a receptionist, or part of the security team itself. Leaving your machine open is never okay. Back then, about 10 years ago, my team had a lighthearted way of enforcing that policy. If someone left their computer unlocked, we didn't immediately report it. Instead, someone would sneak over and type out a harmless message in their chat client or send a goofy email. Things like, "Does anyone know the meaning of life?" or some other random joke. The idea was to give everyone a laugh, but also shame you just enough so you'd remember to lock your computer next time. It was a safer way of reminding people before they racked up official violations that could lead to retraining, write-ups, or worse. One day, a new hire showed up. I introduced myself, shook his hand, and even reminded him about the rule. I told him directly, You need to lock your computer when you walk away. It's company policy. I even sent him the documentation so he could see it in writing, but he just shrugged it off, called it stupid, and made a point of ignoring it. Over the next few weeks, everyone warned him. His team, other teams, even me again. But he kept brushing it off, acting like it didn't matter. Eventually, once he had access to more sensitive information, we decided enough was enough. At that point, he wasn't just ignoring a rule, he was putting things at risk. So one day I saw him walking toward the elevators and figured he'd be gone for a bit. I sat down at his computer, typed out a silly email to his team's distribution list, and hit send. Just as I stood up, he came back and caught me. He demanded to know what I was doing, and I just shrugged and walked off. Later, his manager came by to tell me that the new guy didn't want to play the game. Apparently, he was even considering reporting me to security for impersonating him. Alright then, no problem. If he didn't want to play the game, we'd follow procedure. I told my team and others on chat, no more funny reminders for this guy. If anyone saw his computer unlocked, don't joke around. Just file the official violation ticket. Within the next 2 days, nearly 50 tickets were logged. His desk was right by the break room and the elevators, so people passed it constantly, and every time his computer was wide open. He ended up in mandatory security retraining by Monday. From my seat, I could see him getting upset, gesturing at me while talking to his manager, but it wasn't on me. I'd only filed 2 tickets myself. His manager later asked me to ease up, but by then I couldn't. If I ignored violations, I'd be liable. That Monday, he locked his computer religiously, but by Tuesday, he slipped back into old habits. I walked by and saw his email open again, and when I casually mentioned it, he cussed me out and rushed back to his desk. By then, the damage was done. He had already piled up a dozen new tickets, and the policy had changed. Now it went straight from retraining to a disciplinary action. Not long after, he was called into a meeting with his boss, a director, and security. I found out later he was put on a performance plan, and within a week, he was gone. Nobody was trying to tank his career. But if you're going to work in security and refuse to follow the most basic security policy, then honestly, you don't belong there. That's the end of this story. What stands out to me is how stubborn the new guy was. Locking a computer takes 2 seconds, and yet he acted like it was beneath him. I think it's funny how the team's little prank system was actually saving people from real trouble, until he demanded they stop. Once the tickets started piling up, he didn't even last a week. It's kind of wild to think how one small habit, or refusing to do it, can completely change how long you last at a job. This next story is about a new manager who banned all overtime in a massive plant, only to watch production grind to a halt. Years ago, I worked as a supervisor in a meatpacking plant. The job had its ups and downs, but overall it was steady. Things changed when a new production manager came in. Let's call him Bob. Now, Bob didn't come from the floor, and he didn't even come from leadership. His background was in engineering. I tried to keep an open mind, but honestly, it only lasted about 5 minutes. On his very first day, in our very first meeting, he stood up and declared that he was going to right the ship. That ship he was talking about was already sailing smoothly, but sure boss, whatever you say. Then he made his big announcement. No more overtime. From that moment forward, overtime was banned. He said we were pissing away money by paying for it. I asked him for clarification, like, what about covering vacations or sick calls? His answer was simple. No overtime. No exceptions. All right then, boss man, if that's how you want it. To give you an idea of the scale, my team alone had 70 people. Across the whole department, we had around 220 employees. With a team that size, sick calls were constant. We averaged about 7 a day. On top of that, vacations were always happening. 10% of the workforce was allowed off, which usually meant about 12 people a day. Then you had leaves of absence, people leaving early, you name it. Coverage was always tight, and overtime filled those gaps. That Friday, I went back to Bob one last time. I told him we'd be short 19 people the following week, and asked if he wanted to approve overtime. He gave me a flat no. At that point, I thought about going above him, but honestly, letting him drown seemed like a better plan. So I didn't push it. I told the employees straight up. Bob said no overtime. People asked me again and again if I was sure, and I kept giving them the same answer. When the next week started, 2 of our production lines didn't even run. Bob came storming over, demanding to know what was going on. Was it mechanical downtime? No, Bob. I just didn't have the people to run the lines. He stammered something about better planning and staffing, but I reminded him I'd asked multiple times for overtime approval, and he denied it every single time. I was just following his orders. He stormed off, yelling to get some people in here. By that point, it was too late. I had to call people at home and schedule emergency overtime for the rest of the week because Bob had sunk the ship instead of fixing it. But that first day, those two lines stayed down, and not running them cost the company about $120,000. No exaggeration. Later that day, his boss, a guy I'd known for about 10 years, pulled me aside while we were having a smoke. He shook his head and said, "What was he thinking? I thought engineers were supposed to be smart." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my cigarette. Bob didn't last long. About 3 months in, he was gone. That's where the story ends. I think what makes this story stand out is how quickly things spiraled from one simple decision. It's almost funny how confident Bob was about saving money, and then he ended up losing way more in a single day than any overtime could have cost. I also like how the supervisor just let him run with it instead of fighting back. Sometimes the best way to expose a bad idea is to let it play out. And the detail about his own boss joking during a smoke break really paints the picture of how obvious it was to everyone else. What gets me is that Bob still tried to blame it on planning when he was the one who shut down every option. It's one of those situations where you can almost see the downfall coming from the start, and all you have to do is sit back and wait. This next story is about a truck driver asked to make an impossible delivery onto a residential property, only to let the foreman learn the hard way what that really meant. Back when I was driving, I often handled deliveries with one of the biggest trucks in the fleet, a twin-stick R model Mack boom truck. It was heavy, had a wide turning radius, and was best suited for large commercial or new construction sites. Most of the time, if I had to do a residential delivery, I could stay on the street and avoid rolling onto someone's property. But this wasn't one of those days. I was told I'd be doing a residential roofing delivery, and not just dropping materials at the curb. This one had to go right onto the roof. Immediately, alarms went off in my head. I knew the area and the roads were narrow. To deliver to the roof, I'd have to pull all the way onto the driveway and position the boom. When I got there, the road was exactly what I expected, barely 20 feet wide. The house sat on my left, and the driveway was angled so tightly that there was no way I'd make it without cutting across the lawn and backing up several times. I went to find the foreman and explained the situation. I told him every obstacle clearly. The cars parked on the street would have to be moved. I'd have to drive over the grass to even make the turn, and I couldn't guarantee the driveway could hold the weight of the truck. He didn't want to hear it. He waved me off, shouted that he'd move the vehicles, and barked at me to just get my truck in there. His tone was demeaning, like I was the problem. So I nodded, walked back, and prepared for game on. Before I moved the truck, I pulled out my clipboard. We carried legal forms that transferred liability to whoever signed, meaning they would be responsible for any property damage, damage to the truck or load, or even towing fees if the truck got stuck. I handed it to him and said, "I need you to sign this." He scrawled his name, practically threw the clipboard back at me, and told me to get moving. So I did. I turned in, drove across the yard, and had to back up 4 times just to get fully onto the driveway. By the time I stopped, I looked back at the mess. Deep 8-inch ruts tearing across nearly 30 feet of lawn, chunks of the driveway broken off where the tires shifted from grass to asphalt, and even more damage along the edges. But that was only the beginning. Because the truck was so wide, when I set up the outriggers to stabilize the boom, they went down right into the grass. I used big blocks to spread the weight, but even then, it left massive square holes in the yard. Still, I got the load delivered safely, exactly where it needed to go. Right as I was finishing up, the homeowner came back. He saw the state of his yard and driveway and immediately started yelling at me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even explain. I just pointed straight to the foreman and told him, "You need to talk to him." Then I went back to wrapping up my truck, while they screamed at each other in the background. To make it even better, I had to ask them to move their cars so I could back out. Leaving the property left even more ruts across the grass. Once I was on the street, I paused for a moment to look at the handiwork. It was rough. When I got back to the warehouse, my bosses were already waiting. The contractor's boss had blown up their phones with complaints and threats. Before they could even finish, I pulled out the signed affidavit. One look at that paper, and my boss just shrugged and said, "Well, we're covered." And that was the end of it. That form has saved me more times than I can count. And in moments like this, it made malicious compliance both safe and a little satisfying. That story stops there. What cracks me up here is how fast the foreman signed without even thinking. He basically handed over full responsibility just to sound tough. The part that really stuck with me was when the homeowner came home and immediately went after the driver, only to be redirected straight to the guy who caused it all. It's also kind of funny how calm the driver stayed while the others were losing their minds. And honestly, I can just imagine him standing in the street for a second, admiring the ruts like they were a finished job. Sometimes paperwork really is the strongest tool in the truck. This next story is about a shady landlord who tried to evict his tenant after ignoring major problems with the house, only for things to take a very unexpected turn. Back in the late 90s, my buddy Dan rented a house from one of our old classmates, Chuck. Chuck had inherited the place from his grandmother, and since he had no interest in living there, he rented it out. The place itself was outdated: pink bathrooms, old harvest-colored appliances, dark wood paneling, even a sunken conversation pit in the rumpus room. But for $600 a month, it was a steal. To put it in perspective, my small one-bedroom apartment cost me $425, and this was a two-bedroom with a garage and a big yard. At first, everything went fine. The house quickly became the unofficial hangout spot for a while, until Dan switched over to night shift. That's when things started to get interesting. One morning, Dan called me at 6 a.m., asking if I had the number of a plumber we both knew. He said he'd been having drainage issues for a while and had been telling Chuck about it, but nothing was getting done. Now he had an inch of sewage sitting in the basement, and it couldn't wait any longer. Chuck's answering service wasn't even picking up, so I gave him the number and figured that would be the end of it. I didn't hear anything else from Dan about it, but I did hear from Chuck. The first time I saw him in months, he ran across a park just to complain to me about how Dan had screwed him by calling the plumber. Apparently, the plumber had found a bunch of code violations that Chuck was now responsible for fixing. Except, instead of fixing them, Chuck decided to act like Dan hadn't been paying rent and tried to evict him. I only found out because Chuck saw me at a grocery store and actually left the checkout line just to brag about how Dan was about to be broke and homeless. That didn't sit right with me. So I went out of my way to see Dan that night at the bar. I told him everything, but instead of being surprised, he just smirked the whole time. Finally, he laughed and said, "Don't worry, I've got a good lawyer." Then he turned back to watch the hockey game and told me to hush. Clearly, he had a plan. A couple of months later, things came to a head. It was a freezing Saturday in January, and a group of us were hanging out in the rumpus room playing video games when Chuck's sister, Elle, showed up at the sliding glass door. She had paperwork in her hands and knocked softly. We all paused the game to listen. She came in speaking quietly, barely above a whisper, and I couldn't make out what she was saying from where I sat, but I could hear Dan loud and clear. He asked which paper he needed to sign, and she pointed it out. He signed, asked about the eviction, and she handed him more papers. Dan smiled and said, "Fantastic." Then, as casually as ever, he offered her coffee and even joked by booping her nose before she headed out. We were all stunned. Finally, Dan explained, Chuck had tried to evict him, but not only did he lose, he had to pay Dan enough to cover more than half the value of the house just to make him go away. Ella had stepped in, taken out a mortgage, and bought Chuck out. And now, she was Dan's new landlord. Dan looked around at us and added that since Elle had to cover the mortgage, the rent would probably be going up soon. If anyone wanted to rent a room, he said, let him know. That's where this story finishes. The wild part here is how Chuck tried to play dirty and ended up losing the one thing he actually owned. It's funny how he bragged about Dan being broke when Dan was sitting there with a lawyer ready to turn it all around. The whole scene with Elle showing up, the quiet exchange of papers, and then Dan casually dropping the news, that feels like something straight out of a movie. And the fact that the house went from Chuck's inheritance to his sister's mortgage because of his own arrogance makes it even crazier. Sometimes it's the smug ones who end up losing the hardest. This next story is about a stubborn customer who demanded hay be stacked her way, even after being warned it was unsafe. Back when I was managing a rural stock feed shop, part of my job was delivering hay and feed to local farms. Most runs were pretty straightforward, but every now and then, I'd run into someone who made things difficult. One of those people was a woman I'll call Janice. She was in her 60s, set in her ways, and had that old school attitude of, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, so do it how I say. One summer, in the middle of a nasty drought, she ordered a big load of hay, 60 bales. I drove out in the truck, already knowing it was going to be tough work. The shed she wanted it in was a bit of a distance from where I could park, so every bale had to be carried by hand. On top of that, the sun was blazing down on me with no clouds in sight. It was around 33 degrees Celsius. That's in the 90s for anyone thinking in Fahrenheit. By the time I got started, sweat was dripping down my back, and I knew I was in for a long haul. When I stack hay, I do it the safe way. I interlock the bales in alternating patterns, almost like bricks, so the whole stack locks together and doesn't topple over. It takes a bit more thought, but it's sturdy and safe. That day, I had 2 neat stacks going, 5 layers high. It was looking solid, but then Janice came marching up. She looked at my work and immediately started yelling that I was stacking it wrong. She said there was no way it would all fit in the shed. I tried to explain, but she kept talking over me, muttering about uppity young shits who think they know everything. Then, without hesitation, she started tearing down my stack and restacking the bales all in straight lines, every bale facing the same way. The problem with that method was obvious. 5 bales high, all lined up the same way, meant the stack had no stability. It was basically waiting to collapse like a giant game of Jenga. But if that's what she wanted, fine. Cue malicious compliance. I stacked every bale exactly how she told me to. Neat rows, straight up, no interlocking. When I finished, the whole thing looked like it would topple if someone so much as sneezed near it. I handed her the last bale and said she could put it on top herself. She waved me off, said she'd use that one to feed out later, and happily told me goodbye. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and then I heard it. Oh no. I turned my head and sure enough, 10 bales had fallen right on top of her. She was stuck under a small mountain of hay. I jumped out, pulled the bales off her, and helped her up. She was sore, embarrassed, and a little shaken. I called my boss to explain what happened. He sighed and said, she just won't learn her lesson, will she? So I had to restack all 60 bales again, this time the right way. As I was working, I explained to her why I stacked the way I did in the first place. She winced, rubbed her shoulder, and finally muttered, well, glad one of us knows what they're doing. That story ends there. What gets me about this one is how quickly her own method backfired. The whole situation could have been avoided if she just let him do it the safe way the first time. I also like how he didn't argue. He just stacked it exactly how she wanted, and let the results speak for themselves. The image of him hearing the crash right as he started the truck is almost cinematic. Sometimes, reality teaches the lesson better than any explanation ever could. This next story is about 2 coworkers who tried to push someone out of their job, only to be undone when their target stopped giving them the reaction they wanted. At one point, I worked at a job where I had 2 assistants. Their roles were partly meant to support me, and partly meant to cover their own responsibilities. I reported straight to the manager, and on paper, it should have worked smoothly. But instead, those 2 decided to turn on me. One of them wanted my position, and together they started running to the manager with endless little complaints. On top of that, they refused to do the support work I needed, so I was left scrambling. Around the same time, a couple of other employees quit, which meant I was suddenly juggling the workload of 3 people. The heavier things got for me, the more they seemed to enjoy it. They smiled when I looked exhausted, smirked when I struggled, and it hit even harder because I had once considered them friends. I felt buried under stress, unsupported by my boss, and attacked by people who were supposed to have my back. After a while, even my appearance reflected how rough it was. I stopped caring, dragged myself into work looking worn down, and barely held it together. One evening, I sat at my apartment crying, replaying the look on their faces as I walked out that day. Then it clicked. If my misery made them happy, then maybe my happiness would have the opposite effect. That thought shifted everything. So the very next morning, I got up and did things differently. I brushed my hair, put on makeup, and wore my nicest clothes. When I walked into the office, I carried myself like I was floating on air. I smiled wide, laughed loudly with my favorite coworker who sat right beside them, and acted like nothing in the world could bother me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the 2 exchange a look. wide-eyed, like they knew something was suddenly out of their control. They tried harder the following week. One of them interrupted me constantly, clearly trying to get under my skin. But every single time, I turned to her with a cheerful smile and thanked her sweetly. The more upbeat I acted, the more disappointed she looked. After that, I leaned all the way in. Every time I passed them, I smiled. Every please and thank you was extra sweet. Every interaction was dripping with kindness, and it worked. They grew more unsettled and visibly miserable. Eventually, they convinced themselves I must have had some secret meeting with the manager. One of them even snapped, yelling at him in frustration that she was going to be fired anyway. And she was. Not because of me, I hadn't said a single word, but because she couldn't handle the act any longer. The other one stayed silent after that, clearly rattled. I eventually left that job because management wasn't worth sticking around for. But looking back, I'm still amazed at how much power came from nothing more than showing up happy and refusing to play their game. That's where this story ends. What I really like here is how simple the shift was, just choosing to walk in with confidence and positivity, and it completely flipped the power dynamic. The image of those two looking wide-eyed while pretending nothing was wrong is, honestly, pretty funny. I also think it's wild how one of them literally pushed herself out of a job just because she couldn't stand someone else being happy. It shows how fragile their little scheme actually was. And honestly, the fact that it all came from kindness makes it even better. No yelling, no plotting, just outlasting them with a smile. This next story is about a loudmouth coworker in the Dutch Navy who thought he was untouchable, constantly daring his superiors to fire him. About 20 years ago, I was stationed in Den Helder with the Dutch Navy, and one of my coworkers was the type who made everyone's life harder. Let's call him Adam. He was loud, arrogant, and carried himself like he was above the rules, just because he'd been around for more than a decade. To give you an idea, Adam would brag openly about cheating on his fiancée, then turn around and say he really loved her. If anyone pointed out the hypocrisy, he'd snap, raise his voice, and throw insults in a thick Amsterdam accent. He also had a habit of arguing with every new policy or order, not in a helpful way. He'd just get as offensive as possible, like his goal was to stir conflict. He clashed constantly with our sergeant and the head of transport. He'd tell them he'd been stationed there longer than them, so they should back off. These arguments never led to discipline because he always danced just on the line of insubordination, but everyone could tell the higher-ups were sick of him. On top of that, Adam was reckless with equipment. He'd whip forklifts around aggressively, steering so sharply that the machines wobbled. They were heavy enough to stay upright, but watching him was still nerve-wracking. One time, he even drove a coach on the highway, put it on cruise control, got out of his seat, stood beside the wheel holding it with one hand, and filmed himself with his phone. This was back in the early days of mobile video, so he proudly showed off the grainy clip to everyone. The higher-ups heard about it, confronted him, and he denied everything. With no proof, he got away with it and then laughed, bragging, "What are they going to do? Fire me?" That became his trademark. Anytime he clashed with leadership, he'd end it by shouting, "If you don't like it, then fire me." And afterward, he'd brag to the rest of us that they couldn't fire him even if they wanted to. Over time, the tension in the unit grew heavier. Everyone was on edge, and it was obvious the leaders were waiting for the right chance. Eventually, Adam went too far. He got into yet another shouting match, threw out his usual line, "Then fire me." And this time, the adjutant didn't hesitate. He shot back, "Great, you're fired. Now walk with me to my office so we can make it official." You could feel the shock ripple through the room. We heard Adam shouting from the office at first, loud and fiery like always, but then his tone shifted. It grew desperate, then quiet. When he walked out, his eyes were red, and for once, he didn't say a single word. It turned out the higher-ups had been waiting for exactly that moment to put an end to his behavior. He spent his remaining weeks quietly using up his leave days, acting completely different from the guy we'd known before. And honestly, things felt a lot lighter after he was gone. That story wraps up here. The funniest part to me is how Adam kept daring them to fire him like it was some kind of shield. And then one day, they just did. I can almost picture the silence in the room when the adjutant called his bluff. The shift in his tone from shouting to desperate says it all. Like he finally realized he wasn't untouchable after all. What really sticks with me is how much the mood changed after he left. You can tell everyone had been carrying that tension for a long time. It's wild how one person can drag down an entire unit just by refusing to respect anyone else. This next story is about a remote worker whose bosses demanded equipment back in the middle of a massive project, not realizing how much chaos their decision was about to cause. Back when I was working remotely for a European manufacturer that specialized in high-end broadcast processing gear, I was handling projects that were pretty niche and very technical. The European side of the company had brilliant developers and engineers, and I had a great relationship with them. We could talk for hours about tiny details like capacitor values or IP ranges. The US office, on the other hand, was more of a sales branch. They just took orders and didn't really deal with the complicated troubleshooting. That's exactly why I was there. At the time, I was deep in the middle of a huge project with one of the largest US broadcasters. We had just closed one of the biggest upgrade sales this division had ever made, and I was testing brand new SNMP features straight out of the sandbox. To make it work, I repurposed an older Supermicro server I had lying around. It wasn't fancy, just a one-rack utility server worth maybe $1,000 at most, but it did exactly what I needed. Every morning I'd get a fresh software revision, hammer on it to make sure nothing broke, and then send it along to my contact at the network before the end of my day. It wasn't flashy, but it was critical, and no one else in North America knew how to do this. Then the auditors got involved. They started reviewing inventory, and the US office suddenly lost its mind. They saw this little Supermicro server on the list and immediately demanded to know why it existed. Why was there a server out in the field? Who approved it? Why did I have so much test gear? I explained, multiple times, that it was being used for a major project with one of our biggest accounts, and asked who was going to handle it if they pulled the server. Every single time, I was ignored. All they cared about was getting that machine shipped back. So, I decided to have a little fun. Instead of arguing again, I sent out a cheerful group email. I copied the US office decision makers, my tech contacts at the network, and their boss. In it, I introduced everyone, thanked the US team for taking over this critical project, and explained how much this would free me up for other work. Then I attached the tracking numbers for the equipment they wanted returned. It didn't take long for things to unravel. Within half an hour, I got a nervous email from one of the decision makers, trying to backpedal. He didn't want to admit they had no idea what this project involved, but now that it looked like a huge account was shifting hands, he was clearly panicking. I politely reminded him that I had already suggested 3 times they might want to reconsider, and resent the tracking information. An hour later, I got a frantic call from the head tech at the US office. He and his boss had just received a glowing call from my contact's boss at the network. They were thrilled with how things had been handled so far, and they were excited that someone else would now be testing updates. They even mentioned big future plans, and wanted to know who was taking over this work. That was the moment the panic really set in. I just reminded them that the decision had already been made, and clearly it was an educated one. Meanwhile, I also made sure the developers in Europe sent all future code updates to the general US support inbox instead of me, since they were now officially responsible. That pushed things even further, because the European team started asking who exactly had been hired in the US to suddenly handle such specialized work. By the time the UPS pickup was supposed to happen, the urgency to get that old server back had mysteriously disappeared. No one ever mentioned it again. That's where this story ends. What I like most here is how calm and deliberate the move was. Instead of fighting, he just handed the project right back to the people demanding control and let the weight of responsibility sink in. The timing was perfect. Looping in the client and the developers forced everyone to show their cards. I can imagine the scramble on those phone calls when they realized how badly they'd messed up. And the best part is, the critical server they wanted so badly ended up being forgotten altogether. Sometimes the cleanest revenge is just letting people trip over their own demands. This next story is about a district manager who accused an employee of being useless, only to learn firsthand how much extra work that employee was actually carrying. About 20 years ago, I worked in a toy shop, and as you can imagine, the weeks before Christmas were absolute chaos. Every worker was assigned a section to maintain. Mine was boys' toys, which included all the action figures and big-ticket items kids loved. But here's the catch. I was also the only person on the floor, besides managers, who could process refunds and exchanges. And since my section was right beside the tills, the cashiers constantly called me over whenever a customer had an issue. During the Christmas rush, that meant I was bouncing back and forth non-stop. Now, Our store was part of a franchise, and the district manager, let's call him D, showed up a few weeks before the holidays. He had a business degree, but had never worked the shop floor a day in his life. He walked into Boys Toys about an hour before closing, saw the shelves a bit messy and some gaps where stock had sold out, and immediately tore into me. I tried to explain that I'd been constantly pulled away to handle refunds, but he didn't want to hear it. He stormed off without another word. The very next morning, Dee showed up right at opening time. During the staff meeting, he cut off my manager and announced, "I'm putting myself with her today. She clearly doesn't know how to handle the section, so I'll show her what's what." The room went quiet, but I just kept my head down. When we got to my section, he looked around and demanded, "Well, what's first? Or don't you even have a plan?" I started to explain what I usually did, but right then the tills called for help. I excused myself, dealt with a refund, and came back. I tried again, only to get called away a second time. By the time I returned, it was already 15 minutes into the shift, and he still hadn't touched a single shelf. To give him some credit, he stuck it out. He followed me around all day, lugging stock from the storeroom, tidying shelves only for kids to wreck them again minutes later, and watching me get called to the tills an average of 5 times an hour. I kept count that day just to prove a point. He even had to delay his own lunch break because I got pulled away for yet another refund. By the end of the day, he looked exhausted. He never said sorry. I was far too junior for that. But the very next morning, my manager announced a big change. From that point on, Boys Toys would always have 2 staff assigned, and managers would make more of an effort to cover the tills. Dee never mentioned it again. That's the end of this story. I really like how this one played out because the district manager basically set himself up to learn a lesson. He thought he'd catch someone slacking, but instead he got a front row seat to how much hidden responsibility she was carrying. What makes it satisfying is that she didn't argue, didn't complain, just let him experience it for himself. You can almost picture him trying to keep up with refunds, stocking, and cleaning, realizing how much he underestimated the job. And honestly, the fact that changes were made the very next day says it all. Anyways, that's all the stories I have for you today, and I hope it was a chill listen. If you had a good time, dropping a like and hitting that subscribe button really helps me out. And as always, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next one.